The fist struck the door a third time, and Ren Calder came to, already standing in the middle of the hallway with a crowbar in his hand. The last few seconds of his memory were a blur. He remembered a scream from below and the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Now he could hear the collector's voice through the thin door. The voice said that the residents of Block 7 had 5 minutes to go out into the courtyard with their weekly tribute. The voice added that those who refused to comply would be carried out along with their furniture. Ren lowered the crowbar. Fighting the guild was suicide. 19 days ago, the world had stopped for 4 minutes. The sky had darkened, and a blue window had flashed in everyone's mind. The system had announced the merging of realities. Everyone received an inventory with 10 slots and an energy meter. Then the rift zones appeared, along with the creatures that emerged from them. Then the guilds appeared. The Steel Vanguard Guild took over the eastern districts on the third day. Its fighters received combat classes and weapons from the system's rewards. Ordinary people were given slots for junk and the right to pay for protection. The tribute amounted to 5 rations per apartment per week. Ren had worked as a storekeeper before the merger and had more supplies than his neighbors. Now he had 6 rations and a can of stewed meat left in his inventory. He went out into the courtyard with the others. The October wind was blowing ash from the fault line in the square. 4 men in gray armor bearing a gear emblem stood in the courtyard. Senior Collector Brock Tarn sat on the hood of a wrecked car, flipping through a list on his tablet. Tarn was massive and bored. He called out the residents by apartment number, and the soldiers collected the rations and carried them to their storage cells. The line moved in silence. An old woman from apartment 3 brought out 4 rations instead of 5. She said there was nothing left and that she had nothing to eat for the rest of the week. Tarn didn't even stand up. He nodded to the soldiers, and they carried blankets and dishes out of her apartment and onto the asphalt. Tarn announced that the debt would carry over to the next week with interest, and that the apartment was now pledged as collateral. The old woman stood over her dishes and didn't cry. She simply had no strength left to cry. Ren gripped the strap of his backpack and watched intently. He memorized every wrinkle on Tarn's face. It was his turn. He laid out 5 rations on the hood. Tarn checked the list and looked up. He asked how many Ren had left. Ren replied that he had 1 ration left. Tarn smiled and said that storekeepers always lie. He ordered a soldier to check the lockers. Ren knew the system's rule. You can't force open someone else's inventory, but you can make them show it under threat. The soldier placed his hand on the hilt of his cutlass. Ren opened his inventory window to shared access. Inside lay a single can of stewed meat and a coil of wire. Tarn snorted and lost interest. He noted that Block 7 had closed out the week. Then he raised his voice so the entire courtyard could hear. He announced that, starting with the next collection, the tribute would be raised to 6 rations due to defense expenses for the rift. The courtyard exhaled as one. None of the ordinary folk earned 6 rations a week. This meant debt and collateral for half the block.
It meant that in a month, the Vanguard would own all the apartments in the district, on paper and off. The collectors left. People dispersed slowly, avoiding eye contact. Ren helped an old woman carry her dishes back inside. Her name was Martha Levin. She said she'd lived through 2 wars and that this one was worse. He gave her his last unopened ration and lied, saying he had more. Back home, he sat down on the kitchen floor and began to calculate. 7 days until the next collection. He needed 6 rations. A ration at the market cost 30 credits, or half a day's unloading work at the guild warehouses. Even without food for himself, he wouldn't be able to scrape together 6. The math was simple and deadly. He opened his inventory to move the wire and froze. There were 2 cans in the slot labeled stew. He was sure he'd put just 1 there. He remembered that evening down to the minute. It had been on the first day of the merger, exactly a week ago. Back then, he'd slipped a can into the compartment to test how the window worked. He hadn't opened the compartment since.
He pulled out both cans and examined them. Identical weight, the same dent on the left side of the lid.
The same scratch across the barcode. The second can was unlike the others. It was the exact same can, twice over. Ren sat on the floor, holding in his hands a violation of all the rules of the New World. The system had issued identical rations to everyone. Everyone lived in the same poverty. And his locker had just doubled the food out of thin air. He looked at the energy meter in the corner of the window. The scale read 98 out of 100. It had been exactly 100 that morning. He hadn't used any energy all day. 2 units had disappeared somewhere without his command. Ren slowly shifted his gaze from the cans to the scale and back. In the storekeeper's mind, the knuckles of his fingers were already clicking out the calculations. If an item sits for 7 days, it doubles. If doubling consumes energy, then the ability has a cost and a limit. He didn't yet know either the cost or the limit. He knew only one thing. Not a single person in gray must find out about this. A dog barked in the courtyard, and Ren flinched like a thief. He closed the inventory window and drew the curtain. 7 days until the collection. One secret as big as life itself. He picked up the second can and put it back in the locker. The experiment began that very night. 19 days after the world turned into a game, the Steel Vanguard Guild raised the neighborhood's tribute to 6 rations a week, and Ren Calder found himself on the brink of debt slavery. He discovered that the item that had been sitting in his inventory for 7 days had doubled in value, while his energy meter had dropped by 2 units. Important details. Collector Brock Tarn keeps the records. Neighbor Martha Livin is in debt to the guild, 7 days until the next collection. Ren stayed up until dawn, turning the kitchen into a laboratory. He laid out everything he had on the table. 3 cans of food, a coil of wire, a packet of salt, and an old multi-tool. His mother's silver ring. 10 compartments meant 10 experiments a week, and there was no room for error. He placed a jar, some salt, the wire, and the ring into the compartments. He left the remaining compartments for immediate needs. Then he started keeping a mental log of his observations, just like he used to in the old warehouse. Date of placement. Composition. Scale readings. The week of waiting stretched through his veins like wire. He cut it into segments so he wouldn't go mad. The first segment was at the market on Wednesday. He hauled boxes for the merchant Gaspar in exchange for food and listened to the prices. Gaspar was an old moneylender with a gold tooth and the eyes of a usurer. He laughed out loud at Ren. He said that only a fool accepts payment in salt and cheap canned goods instead of loans. He said that a storekeeper without a warehouse was just a porter with a sense of pride. Ren said nothing and accepted payment in small goods. Cheap items were his ammunition. The second run was on Friday at the fault line. Ren watched from a distance as Vanguard fighters burned the creatures at the perimeter and as medics carried the wounded. He memorized which supplies were disappearing the fastest: bandages, antiseptic, batteries, and 12-gauge shotgun shells. A shortage always starts with the little things, and the storekeeper is the first to notice it. The third raid took place on the night of the 7th day. Ren sat in front of the open inventory window and stared at the slots as if they were a roulette wheel. At midnight, according to the system's internal clock, the slots flashed. 1 can became 2 cans. 1 pack of salt became 2 packs. The spool of wire doubled in size. The energy gauge dropped by 5 units at once. And then the slot with the ring flashed, and Ren was bent in half. The gauge plummeted by 30 units. His vision blurred, and blood began to flow from his nose. He lay with his cheek on the cold floor, looking up at the 2 identical rings in the window. The rule had written itself. The price of a copy rises with the value of the item. A cheap one costs a penny's worth of energy. An expensive one hits like a sledgehammer. He wiped away the blood and laughed for the first time in a month. The ability had a price list. And when it came to price lists, the storekeeper knew how to work with them better than anyone in the world. In the morning, he began to set up the cycle. He cleared out the duplicated cheap goods and exchanged them with Gaspar for two types of new cheap goods. Half went into the storage cells for the new week. Half went towards 6 rations of tribute. The scheme was slow and drab, just like him. There was nothing remarkable about it. The porter was simply making a smart exchange for small change. By the 4th cycle, he had 12 rations, a supply of bandages, and 3 knives. By the 5th cycle, Gaspar had stopped laughing. The old man recounted the goods Ren had brought twice and looked up. He asked where the porter had gotten the turnover of a small shop. The money changer's face shifted before his eyes. The mockery washed off him like paint in the rain, leaving only a stark, shrewd assessment. Ren replied with a prepared story. He said that before the merger, he had worked at a wholesale warehouse and that he knew the addresses of abandoned storage facilities. He said he was taking things out little by little so as not to attract the guild's attention. Gaspar nodded slowly. The lie was plausible because it was based on the truth. The old man offered a fixed exchange rate and a discount. He said that silence was included in the price. Ren agreed, and both understood that each now had a stranglehold on the other. The payment went off without a hitch. Ren laid out 6 rations, and Tarn didn't even look up from his tablet. Invisibility was the best armor. But success had a scent, and that scent spread through the market. A supplier of small goods who was too reliable in a starving district was an anomaly, and anomalies in the New World came at a high price. Ren noticed he was being followed on the 6th cycle. A skinny guy in a fisherman's jacket had shown up at Gaspar's counter for the 3rd day in a row, right as Ren arrived. The guy never bought anything. He looked at Ren's hands, not the merchandise. On Thursday evening, Ren deliberately left the market by taking the long way through the dead quarter. Footsteps behind him turned to follow. The distance was closing. Ahead, the archway of the courtyard loomed dark, and Ran stepped through it first, realizing that a corridor free of witnesses wasn't needed only by his pursuer. Ran had figured out the rules of his ability. The duplication occurs exactly 7 days later, and energy consumption increases with the value of the item. The copy of the ring nearly drained him. He set up a trading cycle through the money changer Gaspar, who had shifted from mockery to a cautious partnership. Important details. The cover story about the abandoned warehouses. The tribute was settled discreetly. For the 3rd day in a row, a skinny guy in a fisherman's jacket has been following Ren, and Ren lures him into a courtyard. The archway swallowed up the sounds of the market, and Ren pressed his back against a niche behind a wall ledge. Footsteps entered the darkness and quickened. The guy in the fisherman's jacket ran past the niche and froze in the middle of the empty courtyard. Faced with a choice of 3 exits, Ren stepped out from behind him and pressed a crowbar against his shoulder blade. He told him not to make any sudden movements. The guy raised his hands and spoke quickly and pitifully. He said his name was Finn and that he wasn't a robber. He said he'd noticed military-grade antiseptic and a package of fever reducers on Ren's counter. He said his sister was 9 years old and had had a fever for 3 days after being scratched by a creature. He said the local doctor had refused to treat her without an upfront payment of 200 credits. Ren held the tire iron and listened for the breath behind the words. His breathing didn't lie. That's how you breathe when you're afraid for someone else, not for yourself. He lowered the tire iron and ordered him to lead the way to his sister. Finn's apartment reeked of illness. A girl named Ada was burning up on a mattress against the wall, and the scratch on her forearm had swollen into black threads. This wasn't just a fever. The creatures from the rift left spores in the wounds, and those spores required an expensive medication. Here, a regular antiseptic was nothing more than water. Ren knew the name of the ampule he needed from what he'd overheard at the perimeter. Sporicide was sold only at the guild shop for 180 credits per dose and by appointment. Ren had 40 credits and a decision he couldn't explain out loud. 1 dose had been sitting in his locker for 5 days. He'd bought it on a trial basis as the district's scarcest commodity, and there were 2 days left until the price doubled. Ada might not survive another 2 days, but giving away his only ampule meant breaking the cycle. The stockkeeper inside him did the math, and the man inside him overruled the calculation. Ren took out the ampule and ordered Finn to run for the medic. Medic Hale arrived an hour later, angry and exhausted. He was a broad man with butcher's hands and a reputation as the best field medic within 3 blocks. He looked at the shabby room and immediately said he didn't perform miracles and that without sporicide, the girl wouldn't make it. Ren silently placed the ampule on the crate. Hale froze. He picked up the ampule with 2 fingers and held it up to the light to check the seal, and his expression shifted from weary contempt to open astonishment. He asked the destitute porter where he'd gotten the medication, which wasn't even available over the counter from the guild. Ren replied that old warehouses were sometimes generous. Hale stared at him for about 5 seconds and kept his questions to himself. The doctor in him prevailed over the investigator. He administered the dose and stayed until morning. By dawn, the blackness in the wound had lightened, and Ada asked for water. Hale stepped out onto the landing where Ren was waiting. He said that in 20 years he'd seen a lot, and that he'd stopped believing in people even before the merger. He said he'd reconsider that stance today. He also said that such discoveries had to be kept quiet because the guild twists the arms of any source of medicine. The council was half a day late. Finn, overcome with joy, let it slip to his neighbor, and his neighbor told the whole neighborhood. By evening, 3 people with sick children and an old woman named Martha Livin, with hope in her eyes, were standing at Ren's doorstep. Ren handed out fever reducers from the compartments and felt the secret unraveling at the seams. And that night, he realized the second problem. The energy gauge was barely holding at 40 units. The cheap cycle was feeding the tribute, but a copy of each ampule of sporicide would consume half the gauge. His ability had hit a ceiling, and that ceiling was called energy. Ren saw the answer the next day near the perimeter. A vanguard fighter had finished off a dog-sized creature by the fence and cut a dull stone from its chest. The fighter crushed the stone in his fist, and the meter above his head flashed green. The creature's cores were batteries. The system explicitly stated this in the manual, which none of the ordinary people read past the first line. Ren read the whole thing. A small core yielded 10 units of energy. The leader's core yielded 50. The zone boss's core yielded a number with 3 zeros, and a note warning of the risk to life if consumed beyond the limit. He spent 3 nights hunting near the dead quarter. He wasn't a fighter, so he didn't fight fair. He set up tripwires made of doubled-up wire, coated rebar with poison made from double the usual amount of insecticide, and crushed scavengers with a slab suspended on a rope. By the end of the 3rd night, he had 4 small cores, a split lip, and a new piece of the puzzle in his worldview. Energy is extracted with blood. He crushed the first eye and the scale obediently rose. The circuit closed into a loop. The cheap cycle feeds the market. The market buys scarcity. The cores pay for copies of scarcity. All that remained was to stay silent and grow in the shadows. But the shadow had already been called into the light. On Saturday morning, there was a polite knock on his door, 3 times. Standing on the threshold was a slender man in a gray cloak, without armor, wearing a ring bearing the emblem of a gear. He introduced himself as Silas Dre, an appraiser for the Steel Vanguard Guild. He smiled subtly and said that the guild loved stories about bountiful old warehouses and would like to hear this story in its entirety. The surveillance had led to an encounter with Finn, and Ren had spent his only ampule of sporicide to save his sister Ada, an act that astonished the medic Hale and unwittingly revealed the neighborhoods on himself. He discovered that the energy for the copies comes from creature cores and obtained 4 small cores through hunting. Important details. A small core yields 10 units, while a boss core yields thousands, with a risk upon absorption. Hale is now an ally. Silas Dre, a guild appraiser, came to Ren with questions about the warehouses. Ren stepped back from the door and let the appraiser in, because a closed door would have spoken louder than any confession. Dre entered and surveyed the shabby kitchen with the eye of a jeweler. He sat down without being invited and placed a tablet on the table. He said that the guild had detected the trafficking of military medical supplies in the area outside its official channels. He said that the source must either become a supplier to the guild at its prices or admit to looting military facilities, and the vanguard hangs looters in the town square to maintain order. Ren sat down across from him and switched on the storage manager. He spoke in a dull, detailed manner, the way people do when they have nothing to hide. He named 3 addresses of warehouses in the West that had actually been looted, which he'd inspected for work prior to the merger. He said he'd been hauling out the remains from under the rubble in small batches, and that the supply was nearly depleted. He offered to hand over the last 2 vials to the guild at its price as a sign of loyalty. Dry listened, running his finger across the tablet. The boredom in the story was the best seasoning for a lie. The appraiser took the vials and issued a receipt for a laughable 40 credits. As he left, he turned around at the door. He said he trusted numbers, not people, and that Ren's numbers added up for now. The word "for now" hung in the room for a week to come. Ren exhaled and realized he'd bought time, not safety. And then the world began to truly starve. The fault zones were expanding and devouring the fields outside the city. Convoys from the south stopped coming in the 9th week. The system posted a global announcement about halving the bonus rations. Market prices went through the roof in 3 days. A ration pack jumped from 30 credits to 110. Ammo disappeared from the market entirely. The guilds introduced ration cards and checkpoints on the bridges. The city was tightening its belt, and Ren Calder turned out to be the only person who'd been preparing for this for a month. His preparations had been building up over the weeks. Here he is at night, picking up a crate of seeds and antibiotics from Gaspar in exchange for double-edged knives and salt. Here he is stashing fuel cells for generators into his storage slots while they're still reasonably priced. Here's Finn, following his list, buying up cheap, loose ammunition in back alleys from those trading them for bread. Here, Hale silently hands him a list of the medicines that will run out first and doesn't ask why. By the 10th week, Ren's inventory was filling 14 slots instead of 10. The system expanded the warehouse due to heavy usage and awarded him a first-rank achievement. His weekly turnover was 3 times that of Gaspar's shop. His reserves could keep the neighborhood from starving for 2 months. And his energy gauge was as dry as a well in a drought. The copies of the shortage were devouring everything. 4 small cores a week from the scavengers covered a third of the need. The cycle had hit its limit, and beyond that limit lay people he could no longer save. Martha Levin had taken to her bed from exhaustion, and Hale said there were dozens of elderly people like her in the district. Finn brought back rumors, each one darker than the last. The Vanguard announced that starting next week, it would conduct an inventory audit of the entire district under the pretext of hunting down speculators. The audit meant the forced opening of every resident's storage cells. The audit meant that Dre's people would see 14 cells filled to the brim with scarce goods. There were 6 days left until the audit, and there was nowhere to hide the contents except in the stomachs of the neighborhood. There was only one solution to both problems, and it lay underground. Hale told them about it while patching up someone else's wound. The zone's boss was holed up at the Severny Uzel metro station. The creatures didn't come out of there because the boss kept the pack close to him. The guild didn't go in there because it had lost an entire reconnaissance team there. The system estimated the boss's core at 2,400 energy units. A core like that would cover the cycle's needs for months. A core like that would allow them to distribute food to the neighborhood until the audit and turn the warehouse into empty storage units and a clear conscience. Ren laid out a homemade subway map and a list of what they'd need on the table. Only suicidal people went there alone. He called Finn and said he needed 2 trusted fighters, not from the guild, for a cut. Finn brought them in the following evening. First to arrive was Tessa Moore, a mercenary with a spear class and a scar across her eyebrow, who had left the vanguard after the incident with that very reconnaissance team. Second to arrive was her partner, Kano, a silent marksman with a homemade rifle. Tessa listened to the plan and looked at Ren as if he were the town madman. She said she'd seen the Node's lair and that you didn't go there with a tire iron and a porter leading the way. Instead of answering, Ren opened 4 compartments in front of her. Ammo for her partner's caliber lay there in zinc-coated cartridges. The grenades Finn had assembled from purchased fuses lay in neat rows. Sporicide and stimulants were packed in quantities not even guild stormtroopers possessed. The mercenary's expression shifted slowly, like ice in the sun. Her skepticism cracked, revealing beneath it the hunger of a professional who had laid eyes on an impossible supply. She asked only one thing. She asked who he really was. Ren replied that he was a storekeeper. He said it in such a way that Tessa didn't ask any further questions. The escape was scheduled for the night before the audit. On the evening of the 5th day, the 4 of them stood by the welded shut entrance to the North Node Station. Kano cut through the weld in 8 minutes. A chill and the smell of sour ash wafted from the black maw of the escalator. Tessa lit her chemical lantern and was the first to step onto the stairs. Ren tightened the straps of his backpack, adjusted his homemade shield made of door steel, and stepped after her into the darkness. Ren fended off the appraiser Dre with a legend and ampoules, but only managed to buy some time. Meanwhile, the city had entered a global shortage, and his secret reserve had become the largest in the region. His inventory had expanded to 14 slots, but his energy was running out, and the guild had announced an audit of all inventories in 6 days. Important details. The boss core of the North Node Station yields 2,400 units. The team consists of mercenary Tessa Moore, the archer Kano, and Finn. The group broke into the subway entrance the night before the audit. The station's darkness was as thick as water and swallowed the light of the lantern within 3 steps. The team descended the dead escalator in battle formation. Tessa led the way, spear at the ready. Behind her was Ren, carrying a shield and a backpack full of consumables. Finn carried spare flashlights and grenades. Kano brought up the rear, covering the upper landing with his rifle. On the lower landing, the tracks began. The floor was covered in gray ash, and scattered among the ash lay the bones of the Vanguard reconnaissance team, along with their melted armor. Tessa paused for 2 seconds over one of the bodies, and her face turned to stone. She said that this was now a personal vendetta. They heard the swarm before they saw it. A dry rattling of hundreds of joints rolled out of the tunnel. The ash-colored crawlers surged in waves across the walls and ceiling. Ren braced his shield against the railing, and the team absorbed the first wave. Tessa's spear pierced the creatures right through, 2 at a time with each thrust. Kano's rifle picked off the crawlers from the ceiling with the steady rhythm of a metronome. Ren worked the magazine loader from behind his shield, feeding magazines from the compartments straight into the shooter's hands. That was his plan. A typical squad carried their ammunition on their backs and died when their packs ran empty. His squad had a supply depot behind them. The ammo never ran out. The grenades never ran out. Stimulants circulated like water. They took down the first wave in 6 minutes, and Tessa looked back at Ren with a new expression. The calculation in her eyes recalibrated her assessment of him toward respect. Ahead lay the station hall, and the master awaited them there. The Ash Guardian rose from the tracks like a reverse landslide. 4 meters of caked ash and stone on a skeleton of rails. In the center of its chest, beneath a layer of armor, an orange core pulsed, and its light shone through the cracks as if through fingers. The system displayed the zone's name and rank above it. The Guardian struck first. A fist the size of a refrigerator knocked down the column behind which Finn was standing. And only Tessa's sweep saved the boy. Kano fired a burst into the chest plate, and the bullets sank into the ash as if into a pillow. The armor absorbed everything. The guard was slow, but the room was small and his arms were long. The group scattered for cover and began to die off one by one. A shard of stone sliced through Kano's shoulder. Tessa was grazed, and her spear bent against the creature's elbow joint. Ren's plan hinged on a single line from the system log. The core breathes. Before each of the boss's strikes, the core flares up, and the chest armor parts by a hair's breadth to release energy. The window lasted less than a second. You can't hit it with a ranged attack during that window. You can only hit it during that window if you stand close, and die almost certainly. Ren shouted at Tessa to hold the creature's right arm and moved under its left, shield in hand and a bundle of grenades from his compartment. The Guardian spotted him, swung a punch, and the core flashed open. Ren jammed the bundle into the gaping slit and leaped behind the overturned car. The explosion from within tore the chest plate in half. The guard roared at a frequency that made the lantern burst, and he sank to one knee. The core burned in the open wound, defenseless and malevolent. Kano emptied his entire magazine of armor-piercing rounds, which Finn had bought up from the back alleys, into it. The core cracked. The giant collapsed face first onto the tracks, and the hall finally fell silent. Tessa stood over the carcass, breathing raggedly. She looked at the loader with the pry bar who had just closed a deal too daunting for an assault platoon and said she was taking back her words about him being crazy. Ren approached the wound in the Guardian's chest. The split projectile was dying, and he had to draw its energy now or never. The help text had warned about the absorption limit, and he remembered the numbers. He placed his palm on the hot stone and opened the absorption channel. The world turned white. 2,400 units flowed into him like a river into a bottle. He came to on his knees, blood streaming from his nose, his health bar full, and the system window before his eyes. The window announced that he had reached the second rank. The window announced that his inventory had expanded to 20 slots. The window announced a new accelerated cycle feature for a marked slot at triple the energy cost. Ren read it and realized that what he was holding in his hands was no longer just a hot water bottle for the neighborhood, but a lever capable of controlling an entire city. They made it back upstairs by 4 in the morning. They split the spoils fairly. Tessa and Kano received small core crystals from the swarm and payment in scarce goods, and both silently agreed to the next contract. Finn received his share and an order to remain silent, even in his sleep. But the city greeted them with bad news. Hale was waiting at the exit, his face ashen. He said the audit had been moved up and would begin not tomorrow, but today at dawn. He said that Dre was personally leading the inspection and would start with Block 7. He also said something that was worse than the first two pieces of news. That night in the square, the Vanguard's town crier announced a decree from Guildmaster Magnus Wall. The decree stated that, due to the shortage, all district inventories were hereby declared a strategic reserve under the Guild's control, and that concealing supplies would be considered an act of rebellion. Ren stood in the ashen light of dawn, with a full energy bar and 20 goodness slots on his shoulders, gazing eastward where a flag with a bawakog. There was no more time to waste. He issued orders on the fly. Finn ran to wake Gaspar for the nightly food distribution to the neighborhood. Hale went to tend to his patients.
Ren strode toward the house, counting. 2 hours until dawn. 3 until Dre arrived. The storekeeper against the guild was beginning his first real battle. There was a knock at his apartment door, came exactly at first light. The knock was polite and came in triplets.
Ren's group cleared North Node Station and killed the Ash Guardian through a vulnerable window in the core with a single strike, while Ren absorbed 2,400 energy units, gaining rank 2, 20 cells, and the accelerated cycle function for triple the price. Tessa and Kano became a permanent team. Important details. The guild has rescheduled the audit for tomorrow morning, and Dre will start with Block 7. Guildmaster Magnus Wall issued a decree declaring all district inventory to be the property of the Vanguard and classifying the concealment of supplies as treason. The chapter ends with a polite triple knock on Ren's door at dawn. The knocking repeated, and Ren opened the door looking like someone who'd been dragged out of bed. Standing on the threshold was Dre, accompanied by 2 fighters and a tablet. The appraiser smiled subtly and said he was pleased to see the guild's supplier at the top of the list and that the formality would take just a minute. He asked Ren to open the inventory in inspection mode. Ren yawned and opened it. Dre stared at the slots for a long time, his finger hovering over the tablet. Inside lay a coil of wire, a packet of salt, 2 cans of cheap canned food, and a tire iron. There was nothing else. 20 storage slots gaped emptily like a swept-clean barn. The appraiser looked up, and for the first time, there was no boredom in his eyes. He asked where the supplies were from, which the porter had paid his tribute and supported his trade. Ren replied that the shortage had eaten everything up and that the old stockpiles had run dry 2 weeks ago. He said that now he lived like everyone else, hand to mouth. The lie was built on a foundation of 6 hours of night work. After returning from the hub, Ren had gutted the storage units to the very bottom. The night was spent making his way through the courtyards. Here's Gaspar, by candlelight, taking 3/4 of the reserve in exchange for a receipt and hiding the boxes in the basement under the fish barrels where the guild won't go because of the smell. Here's Hale carrying the medicine to a hiding place under the clinic's floor. Here's Finn with a wheelbarrow distributing food to apartments throughout the neighborhood and extracting a single promise of silence from each family. Here's Martha Levin crying over a sack of grain and Ren asking her never to thank him out loud. By dawn, the warehouse had turned into a network of 40 hiding places and 100 silent mouths. Dre walked through the apartment, tapped on the walls, and peered under the bathtub. He did this half-heartedly because the main evidence was the empty inventory. An inventory couldn't lie. The system wouldn't allow the compartments to be hidden during an inspection. The inspector typed the word "clean" into his tablet and headed for the exit. At the door, he turned around out of habit. He said the neighborhood looked too well fed for an area that swore it was starving. He said the numbers didn't add up again, only this time in the opposite direction. The door closed, and Ren slowly sat down on the floor. The battle had been both won and lost at the same time. The audit was over, but the suspicion remained on the tablet. The following days revealed the cost of Wall's decree. The guild was stripping the district's inventory down to nothing. People had their last rations taken away in exchange for strategic reserve receipts. In return, they were given vouchers for soup from the field kitchen once a day. The line to the kitchen stretched for 2 blocks, and people were fighting in line. The vanguard called it the city's salvation. The city called it something else, but only in whispers. Ren's neighborhood looked strange against the general backdrop. Here, no one fainted in line. Here, children didn't rummage through the ashes. Hale treated patients without payment up front, and he had medicine. You can't completely hide the fact that you're well fed. It was evident in their gait and the color of their faces, and Dre knew how to read a person's gait. Ren understood that the stash of 100 RTs wouldn't remain secret forever, and that he needed to stay one step ahead. The guild itself suggested the next move. An open tender was posted on the bulletin board at headquarters. The vanguard was seeking suppliers of any quantity of food, medicine, and ammunition in exchange for credits and privileges. The shortage had even squeezed the local landlords. Their bonus allocations from the system had dried up along with the general rations, yet 300 fighters needed to be fed every day. Ren stood by the board, and a plan, bold to the point of ringing. Hiding from the guild was a mouse's strategy. Sooner or later, a mouse gets caught. Instead, he could make himself indispensable to the guild, a supplier they couldn't touch, because without him, the supply chain would collapse. The storekeeper knew this dynamic from the old world. Indispensability protects better than walls. But bidding on a tender in his own name meant signing a confession. A loader from Block 7 with the trading house's turnover was a death sentence. He needed a front. He needed someone with a backstory to explain the goods. Ren went to see Gaspar that evening and laid out his plan on a barrel. Gaspar's trading house would take the tender. The old man, with his 40-year reputation as a money changer, announces that he has re-established pre-war connections with the surviving warehouse cooperatives in the South. The goods will pass through his shop. Ren remains invisible on the inside as the supplier's supplier. Profits are split 50-50 after expenses for the cycle. Gaspar listened, his gold tooth glinting in the candlelight. He said the plan was good until the first time the Southern legend was put to the test. He said that Dre would get any cooperative that didn't exist to spill the beans. Ren replied that the cooperative would exist. He laid out the second part of the plan on the barrel, and the old man fell silent for a long time. South of the city, beyond the first fault zone, stood a defunct logistics hub. Before the merger, it had been a hub for his old company, and Ren knew its layout by heart. If they set up a base there with people, lights, and stamps, the legend would take on a life of its own. Tessa and Kano could clear the area and hold the perimeter. Finn could recruit a dozen reliable, desperate souls from the lines at the field kitchen. The hub would serve as both a backdrop and a real base of operations, far from Dre's prying eyes. Gaspar thought for a long time and then held out his hand. He said that for the first time in 40 years, he was investing in a show, and that if the curtain fell, they'd be hanged side by side. Ren shook his hand and set off south with his team that night. It took them 2 days to take the hub. The creatures of the first zone were weaker than the node's crawlers, and small projectiles from them flowed into the scale like a steady stream. On the third day, a homemade flag with a drawn ear of grain was raised above the hub's gates, and in the former control room, Finn was setting up desks for the office ledgers. The Kolos Southern Cooperative was born from ashes, lies, and double-strength salt. A week later, Gaspar's trading house won the first lot of the tender to supply 1,000 rations. Dry came to the store in person to verify the paperwork, and the documents matched down to the last stamp. Ren watched the inspection from behind the curtain in the back room and saw the appraiser frown at the perfect numbers. Perfection was once again suspicious. As he left, Dry told Gaspar that he would definitely visit the Southern partners in person as soon as road conditions permitted. Road conditions became Ren's personal concern that very night. Ren passed the audit with an empty inventory, having distributed the reserve among the neighborhood's 40 stashes, but Dry noticed the area's abundance and harbored his suspicions. The guild seized the residents' inventory and announced a tender for supplies, and Ren created a sign. Important details. Gaspar's trading house won the tender on behalf of the fictional Southern cooperative, Kolos. The actual base is a captured logistics hub beyond the first zone, where Tessa Kano and Finn's people are stationed. Dre promised to come south to inspect it. The road to the south was the lifeline of the entire operation, and that lifeline had to be maintained. Ren spent 2 weeks on it and handled the installation himself so as not to get bogged down in the details. Here, Tessa's team is setting up signal posts along 3 kilometers of the route and hanging bells made from gas cylinders on the poles. Here, Kano is teaching Finn's new recruits how to shoot at bottles, and half of the new recruits are eating 3 meals a day for the first time in their lives. Here, Ren himself is stocking the storage cells with fuel and spare parts at night, and by morning, the hub receives twice as much as yesterday. Here, Kolos's first convoy enters the city under escort, and the line at Gaspar's shop stretches all the way to the intersection. The city was changing along with the delivery schedule. The Vanguard's field kitchens were no longer the only source of food, and the lines there had shortened by 2/3. Market prices began to creep downward for the first time in a month. People in the neighborhood started greeting Ren first, even though they didn't know why they felt like doing so. His indispensability was being built brick by brick. This season's skeptic turned out to be someone from whom Ren hadn't expected any attention. Irene Soule, head of the guild's blacksmithing workshop and, concurrently, the Vanguard's chief technologist, entered Gaspar's shop. She was a stern woman in her 50s, with hands scarred by old burns and a reputation as someone who could not be fooled when it came to materials. She placed a bolt from the latest Colossus shipment on the counter and said that no warehouse in the South carried steel like this, because before the merger, only 2 factories in the country had produced this alloy, and both were located in fault zones. She asked where the cooperative was getting this impossible-to-find material. Gaspar started singing the same old tune about pre-war reserves, and Irene cut him off in the second verse. She said she hadn't come to pressure the supplier, but to find his real source, because the guild's forges were running out of alloying additives, and Wall's weapons program was dying. She said she was willing to pay triple and keep quiet. Behind the curtain of the back room, Ren listened and weighed his options. A technician with such hunger in his voice was worth more than 3 contracts. He stepped out of the back room and Irene eyed him from head to toe as if he were a piece of raw material. He said that the source was closed, but they were expanding the channel, and that Colossus didn't need loans from the guild. It needed the creature cores that Wall's fighters turned into the treasury by the sackful. A trade of steel for cores. Irene looked at him for a minute, and then laughed dryly and briefly. She said it was the first time she'd seen a Southerner who wanted stones instead of money, and that the deal was done. Thus, the cycle received a second surge of energy. Cores from the guild treasury flowed into the hub under the guise of payment, and Ren's scale ceased to be a bottleneck. He marked 1 cell with the accelerated cycle function, and now the critical shortage doubled in 2 days instead of 7, though it consumed 3 times the cost. The system responded to the intensity with a 3rd rank, a threshold of 30 cells, and a new line in the interface. The line was called Storage Resonance and was grayed out and inactive, with a note indicating insufficient energy class. Ren tapped the note and received a help message that left him sitting on the box in shock. Activation required the core of a catastrophe rank creature. There were 2 such zones in the region, and both were off-limits even to assault brigades. He closed the window and decided he still had a long way to go before reaching that level. The latter had other ideas. The problem came from exactly where problems are supposed to come after success. Wall tolerated others' success on his own turf only until the treasurer's report. At the Guild Council, the treasurer reported that a quarter of the treasury's cores were going to the Southern Cooperative and that Gaspar's trading house was catching up to the Vanguard itself in terms of turnover. Wall was a man as straight as a railroad track. He didn't bother poring over the paperwork. He ordered Dre to finally reveal who was behind the Colossus, and he ordered the field commanders to prepare a push south to take the hub under a protectorate. In his hands, the word protectorate meant a garrison and complete control. Hale learned of the council's decision from a wounded officer who owed him his life and his leg. That same evening, the military council convened at the hub. Tessa laid out a defense map on the table and said that the perimeter would hold out for an hour against an avant-garde company. Kano silently held up 2 fingers, and everyone understood that he was giving them 2 days before the assault. Gaspar suggested negotiating and giving Wall a share. Ren listened while looking at the map of the region. His finger rested south of the hub, on the border of the second fault zone. He said that the war couldn't be won by fighting the guild head-on, but it could be won using others' hands. Everyone looked at him. He explained the plan, and the room fell silent. The second zone had been swelling and pulsing over the past few weeks. Tessa's scouts had twice spotted leader-rank creatures on its edge, which meant the pack was about to break through to the outside. The direction of the breakout was determined by the leader, and the leader could be lured out. The creatures were drawn to large energy emissions like fish to bait. If, on the day of the Vanguard's assault, a cluster of warheads from the reserves were fired at their column, the pack would overwhelm the strike company in the field. The guild would be drenched in blood and would have no time to worry about the protectorates. Tessa said this was war, not trade. Ren replied that Wall had declared war at his council, and he was merely choosing the battlefield. He also mentioned the very reason the whole operation had been launched. After the battle, dozens of Alpha warheads would remain on the field. The swarm would be weakened, and the edge of the second zone would be exposed. The path to the disaster rank creatures began right there. 2 days were spent preparing, shown in brief snapshots. Here's Finn with 2 guys burying bundles of cores along the southern road according to the plan. Here's Kano taking aim at distant targets along the zone's edge. Here's Ren using an accelerated cell for the first time to double the supply of armor-piercing rounds in 2 days, and the scale howls at the triple price. At dawn on the 3rd day, dust from the vanguard column rose from the direction of the city. 120 fighters and 6 vehicles were marching to bring the enemy's success under their protectorate. Ren stood on the hub's tower with binoculars, holding the detonator from the first charge in his hand. He felt no sense of triumph. He felt a chill run down the back of his neck because, on the other side of the field, a gray wave of an awakened swarm was already rising from the haze of the second zone, and the wave was twice as large as expected. Kolos had become the city's main supplier, and the guild's technologist, Irene Sol, had approached Ren and arranged an exchange of steel for cores from the treasury, which solved the energy problem. Ren attained the 3rd rank, 30 cells, and a locked resonance function requiring a catastrophe rank core. Wall ordered the hub to be placed under protectorate, and Ren decided to lure the second zone swarm toward the guild's convoy using cores as bait. Important details. The swarm's breakthrough was twice as large as anticipated. After the battle, Ren plans to head to the edge of the second zone for a catastrophe rank core. Irene is a strategic ally. Dre continues to dig. The vanguard convoy entered the marked section of the road at 7:20 a.m., and Ren closed the first chain. The core charge detonated beneath the roadside, silent to humans but deafening to the creatures. A pillar of energy rose above the field like an invisible beacon, and the gray wave from the edge of the zone changed course as if it were a single organism. From there, Ren could only watch, and he watched intently because he'd ordered this show himself. The horde overran the convoy in the open field 11 minutes later. The vehicles had managed to form a circle, and the front ranks of the crawlers were mowed down by volleys of fire. Then the leaders emerged from the haze. There were 4 of them, and each was as tall as a truck. The guild's formation collapsed within a quarter of an hour. Through his binoculars, Ren saw the fighters abandoning their vehicles and rolling back toward the road, just as Ironwall himself, leading the rearguard, was retreating and hacking at the creatures with a 2-handed sword in time with his steps. The guild was being drenched in blood according to his plan, and the sight of it left a taste of iron in his mouth. Tessa, on the neighboring watchtower, said in aid that if the pack finished off the company, the city would be next. Ren had already come to the same conclusion. A pack twice as large wouldn't disperse after the battle. It would follow the trail of the retreating troops straight to the northern districts, where there were no walls, only Martha Levin and lines outside the kitchens. The plan, orchestrated by others, had reached a fork in the road where both paths led to bloodshed. He gave an order that upended the entire scenario. The hub entered the battle on the vanguard side. Kano's long-range crews took out 2 pack leaders with shots to the air intakes, a weak point known only to Ren from the system's intelligence reports. Tessa led the mobile group to the flank and cut the pack off from the convoy. Ren himself drove out onto the field in the hub's only open-bed truck, loaded with supplies. He moved along the disjointed formation of the guild, and his team worked like an assembly line. Ammo into outstretched hands, cable bundles and sporicide to the medics, grenades to the machine gun crews. The vanguard fighters took ammunition from a nameless southerner and didn't ask where the bottomless bed of the truck came from. Because in battle, you don't ask questions. By noon, the swarm had been broken. The remnants of the wave receded into the haze, and the field was left behind. The field was a horrific sight. 42 of the guild's fighters did not rise again. The creatures lay in heaps, and among them smoldered the bodies of their leaders. Wall stood in the middle of it all, leaning on his 2-handed sword, watching as the men from the outpost gathered the wounded alongside their own. Then his eyes found Ren's, and he walked toward him across the field, heavily and directly. The guildmaster was a head taller and twice as broad, and his face was stained brown with the blood of others. He stopped a step away and remained silent for a long time. Then, he said he'd come here to take over the warehouse, but the Southerners had blocked his men with their own bodies and supplies. He said he didn't understand such deals. Wren replied that it wasn't a deal, but a matter of neighborly relations, and that a dead city had no use for warehouses. Wall looked him in the eyes for another 5 seconds and then held out his hand. The handshake felt like a vice grip. He announced in front of his officers that the Colas Cooperative was henceforth a full-fledged ally of the guild, and that anyone who laid a hand on the Southerners would have him to answer to personally. The protectorate died on the very field where it was born. Dre stood among the officers, not clapping once. His eyes worked like calculating machines. He was the only one on the field looking not at the heroism, but at the truck bed that over 3 hours of battle had delivered enough supplies for a battalion. That evening at headquarters, he placed a report on the Southerners' impossible logistics in front of Wall. Wall flung the report into the corner. He said that an accountant was looking for dirt under the fingernails of the hand that had pulled the guild out of the grave. He forbade anyone from touching Kolos. Dry silently retrieved the report from the corner, and Wren learned about this scene from Irene a day later. The chief's ban didn't stop the appraiser. It merely drove his work underground. While the city mourned and celebrated, Wren returned to the field at night with his team. The leader's cores were gathered into 4 crates, and after absorbing 2 of them, his scale rang at its limit. The rest were stashed in the hub's cache as currency and fuel. And then he headed for the edge. The calculation had been half correct. The pack had cleared the approaches to the second zone, and the group passed through 3 kilometers of mirage without a single shot fired. Beyond that lay the territory described in the systems report with short, menacing lines. A second-order zone, a disaster-level entity. Name, the Graveyard Chorus. Recommendation, avoid. The chorus revealed itself at dawn with a sound. From the quarry pit in the center of the zone rose a polyphonic hum that made the skin tremble and thoughts go haywire. Kano lowered his binoculars and, for the first time since they'd met, spoke a long sentence. He said he'd seen this creature on the edge last month, that it consisted of the fused bodies of its previous victims, and that there was nowhere to aim because the core migrated within the mass. Tessa looked at Wren and asked if he'd seen enough. Wren was staring at the void, at the scale, and at the gray resonance bar on the interface. He said they were leaving today. He also said they'd be back because the path to this creature was now mapped, and there are no unsolvable problems for the storers, only understaffed ones. The return to the hub took place without fanfare and with a new concern. Irene was waiting at the gate, her face as expressionless as wood. She said she'd brought 2 pieces of news, and both were bad. The first, Dre, unbeknownst to Wall, had sent 2 of his men south to search for the Colossus cooperatives at their old addresses, and they'd returned empty-handed and full of questions. The second piece of news was worse. The system had issued a regional warning about zone synchronization. In 40 days, all the region's fault lines would go into resonance, and the zones would begin to expand rapidly. The city walls wouldn't survive that. The Council of Guilds for the Greater Region announced a mobilization of all forces and resources. Attached to the warning was a registry of strategic reserves, where the treasurers of all guilds were required to declare their reserves under unified command. Irene set her tablet on the table and said that, according to this registry, Kolos was required to open the Commission's warehouses within a week. Wren looked at the line in the registry and heard the box slam shut. 40 days until the catastrophe that would require his reserves to be made public. 7 days until the commission that would reveal that the reserves, as declared, did not exist, but that there was a man with an impossible cell. He looked up at Tessa and Irene and said it was time to stop hiding the source. He said it was time to legalize the source, but on his own terms, and that for those terms, he needed what lay in the quarry of the second zone. The room fell completely silent. The lured pack nearly destroyed the vanguard column, and Wren joined the battle on the guild's side. thereby saving it and receiving ally status and protection from Wall, while the protectorate was revoked. Dre noticed the bottomless supply and continues to dig, despite the head's ban. Ren collected the leader's cores and scouted the zone of a disaster rank boss named the Grave Choir, whose core migrates within a mass of bodies. Important details. The system has announced zone synchronization in 40 days. The Registry Commission will open the Colossus's warehouses in 7 days. Ren decided to legalize the source on his own terms, and to do so, obtain Chor's core. Ren outlined his legalization plan to a select group that night, and at first, they thought he was delusional. He proposed not hiding from the commission, but taking the lead on its agenda. In 7 days, Colossus was to present a miracle to the region. Not a warehouse that could be seized, but a function that could not be replicated. The supplier would vanish. A reserve fund for humanity emerges, with a single manager, security provided by 2 guilds, and the reputation of a savior. No one asked the fund where its resources come from. They asked the fund how much and when. But the miracle required scale, and that scale hinged on the gray line of resonance and the creature from the quarry. Irene asked what the resonance provided. Ren read from the manual. The function extended the storage effect to a linked external volume. Simply put, the entire building, not just a single cell, became a marked storage area. The volume figures depended on the class of the absorbed core. With a catastrophe core, we were talking about thousands of metric tons. Gaspar whistled and said that with a function like that, the word shortage would cease to exist as a concept. Ren nodded and added that the concept had a week left to live. They spent 4 days preparing for the hunt for the Grave Choir, and the preparations involved cutting back on sleep. Here's Irene in the guild's forge, secretly casting 6 long spears with hollow tips based on Ren's blueprints, grumbling that the client has lost his mind. Here's Kano, using his calculations to 0 in the large caliber barrels from the doubled reserves that were delivered to the hub. Here's Hale preparing stretchers and liters of sporicide and making everyone memorize the nerve center locations. Here's Ren using up the leader's cores one by one, and the accelerated cell doubles the incendiary mixture for 2 days straight until the gauge starts to crack. The plan was based on Hoare's sole weakness, gleaned from between the lines of the report. The core migrated within the mass of bodies, but this migration was not chaos, it was flight. The core was fleeing from pain. If the mass were burned in sectors, the core could be driven like a beast into a pre-selected dead end. The concrete gallery of an old conveyor belt at the bottom of the quarry was designated as the dead end. Irene's hollow spears carried a charge of incendiary mixture in their tips and were to serve as the walls of the corral. On the 5th day, a group of 11 people entered the zone. They reached the quarry in 3 hours, quietly dispatching any minor obstacles along the way. The horde was waiting at the bottom, and up close it looked even worse than through binoculars. The mountain of fused bodies, as tall as a 4-story building, breathed as a single entity and sang its own note, a sound that made blood run from the noses of the 2 newcomers. Ren positioned his teams along the rim and descended to the bottom himself with the spear group because he didn't know how to send people somewhere he hadn't gone himself. The drive began with a red rocket. A large caliber round from the rim ripped through the southern slope of the mountain, and the carcass lurched northward in pain. The spears formed the first wall of fire and cut off the western sector. The horde roared with every throat at once and crept toward where it was being led. After that, time melted into a single long breath. The carcass advanced like a wave, and the wave burned and reshaped itself. Tessa led the spear group, repositioning the walls of fire, and twice pulled people out from under the spreading bodies by the collar. Kano, from the edge, struck the bulging humps on the mass, preventing it from forming striking spurs. Ren followed the fire with his last pair of spears, his eyes fixed solely on the indicator in his interface. He was the only one who could see the energy directly, and therefore the only one who could tell where the core was currently hiding inside the mountain. The core darted from one burn mark to the next, and with each sector, its corridor narrowed. At the 40-minute mark, the mountain squeezed into the throat of the gallery and became stuck in the concrete. The core was driven into the far end of the carcass like a heart into the heels. Ren ordered the final wall to be erected and personally drove both spears into the closure. Fire engulfed the throat in a ring. The disaster-rank creature found itself in a stone sack where it could neither turn around nor reposition itself. Then the cannons with long, methodical bursts until the outer mass crumbled to ash, and only a bare, migrating core the size of a barrel remained inside the concrete pipe. It crawled through the gallery on its own muscle bundles, and it was the most repulsive sight in the New World. Kano pinned the muscle bundles down with 3 shots. A silence fell that made their ears ring. Casualties amounted to 4 wounded, and not a single dead. And Hale said he would add this day to his personal collection of the impossible. Ren approached the core and activated absorption, and the world turned white again. Only now the whiteness lasted and lasted. 11,000 units flowed into him for a quarter of an hour. He woke up with blood streaming from his nose and ears, but with a new volume scale, a glowing resonance bar, and a notification that he was 1 step away from the 5th rank. They had a vague memory of the return journey because they'd been carrying the wounded and sleeping on the move. And that same night at the hub, Ren performed the activation. He selected the hub's central hangar as the linked volume, and the resonance bar flashed green. The hangar flickered. Now everything inside it was considered inventory. 3,000 metric tons of usable volume entered a weekly doubling cycle. Gaspar walked between the racks, touching the bags and repeating that the curtain could now remain up forever. The Registry Commission arrived at the hub right on schedule 2 days later. It was led by a representative of the Regional Guild Council named Magister Orvin, a dry bureaucrat with a portfolio of authority, and with Dre and his entourage as a numbers expert. Ren met them at the gates openly under his own name and led them straight to the hangar. He no longer hid the source. He demonstrated its function. Before the Commission's eyes, a metric ton of rations, stored in a marked section of the hangar a week earlier in the presence of witnesses and documented in an official record, was rolled out, and the scale showed 2 metric tons. Orvin personally recounted the rations 3 times. Then Ren demonstrated the accelerated section, and the box of ammunition doubled in size over 2 days under the Commission's seal. The official sat down on the box instead of the chair. Ren announced the terms he had been preparing all week. The Foundation operates throughout the entire region under his sole management. The guilds provide security for the creature cores and raw materials. The Council approves the distribution quotas, but the Foundation handles the priority and logistics. Any attempt at a forceful takeover is pointless because the function is tied to his person and dies with him. He uttered the last phrase not at Orvin, but at Dre. The appraiser held his gaze and suddenly, for the first time since they'd met, smiled genuinely. He said the numbers had finally added up. The Regional Council approved the fund within a day, under pressure from the looming disaster timeline. And so, 30 days before the zones were scheduled to synchronize, a former porter from Block 7 became the administrator of humanity's largest resource reserve. On the 30th day before the deadline, intelligence brought news from the north that caused the regional map to be laid out on the headquarters table. And it never left it again. The zones began synchronizing earlier than expected. Ren's group drove the graveyard chorus into a concrete tunnel with a fire squad and extracted the core of the disaster, 11,000 units. Without any casualties, Ren activated the resonance, transforming the hub's hangar into a 3,000 metric ton, self-doubling warehouse, and openly demonstrated the function of the Registry Commission. The Regional Council approved the Humanity Reserve Fund under his sole management, with the function tied to his person. Important details. Dre acknowledged that the numbers added up. 5th rank and a new scale. Zone synchronization began ahead of schedule, and there are less than 30 days until the catastrophe. Early synchronization ate up a third of the region's preparation time in a single night. The edges of all zones lit up and began to creep forward. Within a week, the northern zone reached the suburban settlements, and the residents had to be evacuated to the city. The city swelled with refugees. 40,000 mouths flooded the ration card system in 10 days, and the Guild Council headquarters turned into a round-the-clock cacophony. The Wren Foundation stood at the center of this storm like an axis. The Foundation's work proceeded in fits and starts because there was no other way to describe it. Here, the hub's hangar receives convoys of grain from all the surviving farms, and a week later delivers twice as much. Here, the second resonance section, running at its next level, devours a trainload of steel for the walls, and Irene greets the doubled supply of metal at the forge with tears she blames on the smoke. Here's Finn, now head of logistics, directing convoys according to a schedule planned down to the minute. Here, Hale is setting up a 1,000-bed hospital in the former depot, complete with a medicine warehouse that would have been enough for a pre-war region. The City 8 received medical care and built walls from its stockpiles, and no longer asked where it came from, because the answer hung on the Foundation's gates on a white flag bearing an ear of wheat. Master Orvin himself became the skeptic of the month. The official came to the hub once a week for inspections, and during his first visits, he behaved like an auditor in a crook's shop. He sealed the sections, weighed the bags, and cross-checked the records. In the fourth week, he arrived without seals and without an entourage. He walked silently along the shelves and then told Wren that he had managed supply chains for 30 years and had always believed that there were no miracles in logistics, only falsified records. He said he had been wrong exactly once, and that he was glad to have lived to see that mistake. From that day on, Orvin's signature appeared on any fund request without delay. But the law of victory worked without rest, and a new problem arose, larger than the previous ones. It was brought about by the very nature of the ability itself. Synchronization empowered the creatures, and the region's consumption rate was growing faster than the doubling cycles. Wren sat poring over tables night after night, and watched as the curves converged on a point of deficit precisely on the calculated day of peak synchronization. It wasn't a matter of volume. The new resonance sections provided the volume. What was lacking was energy. Even with the cores from the two guilds and the hunting cooperatives, the balance was in the red. The replicas of food for 500,000 people and steel for 10 kilometers of walls consumed more than the region could extract from the creatures. The answer was written in the system report in cold, impersonal typeface. One class above a disaster was the Cataclysm rank. A core of that class was estimated to cost a figure with 5 zeros. And the region knew the source of such a class all too well. At the epicenter of synchronization, on the site of the old mining complex, a mother zone was growing, from which all the others radiated outward. Guild reconnaissance teams had approached its edge twice, and both times returned with only half their members. No one had ever seen the master of the epicenter in its entirety. They had only seen what it was doing to the landscape. The hills around the complex were shifting. Wren brought the matter before the regional council, and the council was divided. Wall pounded the table and declared that storming the epicenter would spell certain doom for any force and that they needed to hold the walls. Orwin tallied the resources and remained silent, the terrifying silence of a man whose numbers simply didn't add up in real life. Dre, now the Foundation's official analyst, laid Wren's calculations out on the table and said that without energy for the Foundation, the walls would hold out for 1 month less than necessary, and that the choice was not between an assault and defense, but between an assault and a slow starvation behind the walls. The council voted to prepare for the operation by a margin of 1 vote. Wren had been working on the epicenter plan for 3 weeks as the biggest logistical challenge of his life. He didn't believe in a heroic assault. He believed in a well-prepared position and an unending supply line. The plan rested on 3 pillars. The first pillar was the road. A combined task force would cut a corridor to the old administrative building of the industrial complex, 2 kilometers from the epicenter, and the building would be turned into a fortress. The second pillar was resonance. Wren marked the building as a linked zone, having pre-positioned caravans of ammunition and food there, so that the fortress would have a bottomless supply line right in the heart of hell. The third pillar is a reverse decoy. All nearby swarms are lured away from the corridor by false energy beacons generated from cores, using a scheme tested on the Vanguard, only now for the greater good. Preparations are underway across the entire region. Here's Irene, pouring walls of prefabricated armor for the hull day and night, with her workshop operating at double the metal output. Here's Tessa, appointed by the Council as commander of the Combined Detachment, drilling 800 fighters from 3 guilds at the training ground and instilling in them the importance of logistics. Here is Kano, with his sniper company, mapping out the sector around the plant using aerial photographs. Here is Ren, guiding the last caravans through the accelerated sections, and his new scale, after the Cora Core is hitting rock bottom for the first time. A week before the launch, what was bound to happen according to the chain of enemies' actions did happen. At night, a sabotage group without insignia entered the hub. 8 people passed the outer post through blind spots as if following a score, and were met at point-blank range at the inner perimeter, because Dry had spent 3 months building a second invisible line specifically for such visitors. 5 were killed. 3 were captured. Dre himself conducted the interrogation, and by morning, the details of the hit were laid out on the table. The trail led to a neighboring region, to an alliance of guilds that had refused to join the United Front and for whom the Reserve Fund was a thorn in their side, a source of power from an outside council. The hit wasn't on the warehouse. They didn't need the warehouse because without Ren, it was dead. The order was for Ren himself. Killing the manager meant killing the fund and buying the neighbors a seat at the winner's table after the region fell. Tessa suggested a return visit. Ren forbade it. He said that fighting a war on 2 fronts a week before the epicenter would be a gift to both the vermin and the neighbors alike. Instead, he made a knight's move through Orvin. The regional council officially added the neighbors to the registry of heirs to the fund's supplies after the synchronization peak. The neighbors were publicly promised food if the region held out. From that day on, killing Ren would deprive them not of a competitor, but of their future ration. After reading the text of the decision, Dre said it was the first time he'd seen a person protected by the enemy's appetite. The night before his departure, Ren walked around the hub alone. He passed along the resonance sections where the cycles were breathing. He stood at the gate where 3 months earlier they had raised a homemade flag. Then, he climbed the watchtower and gazed for a long time toward the north, where a glow the color of cooling steel hung over the epicenter. Somewhere out there roamed a creature that shifted hills and carried 5 zeros worth of energy in its chest. Down below at the gate, a convoy of 800 people and 100 vehicles was forming. At dawn, Tessa climbed the tower and stood beside him. She said the convoy was ready and asked if the storekeeper was ready. Ren replied that the warehouse had been packed and the inventory taken. He fastened the gate and walked down to the vehicles. The convoy set off northward as the sun touched the edge of the dawn glow and the 2 lights met above the road. The early synchronization brought a flood of refugees to the city, and Ren's fund became the region's supply hub, turning the skeptic Orvin into his chief ally. The calculations showed that there wouldn't be enough energy to last until the peak, and the only solution was a Cataclysm rank core from the Mother Zone near the old plant. The council approved the operation. The plan relies on a stronghold in the administrative building 2 kilometers from the epicenter with a resonant, bottomless rear and diversionary beacons. Important details. A neighboring alliance has ordered Ren's assassination and neutralized his status as heir to the supply lines. Tessa commands a combined detachment of 800 fighters. Ren's health bar is nearly empty. The convoy has reached the epicenter. It took 2 days to clear a path to the plant, and the road immediately proved to be worth 5 zeros. The ground north of the old interchange was not earth, but a crust covering something alive. The crust was breathing. The vehicles moved along the cleared strip in single file, and Irene's sappers set fire to suspicious mounds ahead of the convoy. The decoys worked as intended, luring the main swarms east toward the false energy pillars, but the epicenter kept its own retinue close. The creatures of the retinue were unlike any seen before. They were fused with stone and asphalt and rose straight from the crust without warning. The first battle took place at the 8th kilometer, when a creature as long as a train emerged from the road embankment and crushed the lead vehicle along with its crew. The convoy lost 6 men and learned to fire at the ground before firing at silhouettes. Tessa reorganized the formation, and from then on they moved in echelon with a double ground patrol. Ren rode in the center of the convoy and did what he always did. The supply units issued replacement barrels for the overheated ones, refueled on the move, and delivered sporicide to the medical trailer. By evening of the second day, the convoy had moved into the abandoned village near the industrial complex and occupied the administrative building. The building was solid, a 3-story pre-war concrete structure with basements and narrow windows. The next 24 hours were spent fortifying the stronghold. Here, the soldiers are placing iron armor shields in the window openings, and the building is becoming encased in steel like a beast in its winter coat. Here, Kano is marking out sectors on the roof, and his company is settling into the top floor. Here, Ren is going through the basements and marking the building's central warehouse with resonance, and from that moment on, the fortress gains a rear of bottomless depth. The caravans of supplies laid in advance doubled in number within the already besieged territory. By nightfall, the fortress was ready, and that's when the epicenter noticed the guests. The host had come to look at them in person. At first, there was silence. The retinue of creatures receded from the settlement, like water before a wave. Then, behind the plant's spoil heaps, a hill rose, one that hadn't appeared on the aerial photographs, and the hill began to move. The creature emerged into the open space in the glow of the fire, and 800 people on the walls fell silent at once. It was the size of the ore processing plant it was passing by. Its body, made of compressed rock and slag, was supported by 6 pillars as thick as factory pipes. Deep within its hull, meters beneath the stone, a white core burned, and its light flashed through the cracks like lightning in a cloud. The system displayed a name, and a whisper spread along the walls at the mention of it. Mountain Father. Cataclysm rank. The report provided no recommendations whatsoever. The father stopped a kilometer from the fortress and stood there for an hour. He did not attack. He was studying. Then he turned and walked away behind the slag heaps, and that was more terrifying than an attack, because creatures of the disaster rank didn't know how to hold back. This one did. The military council gathered in the basement at midnight. Dre laid out the images and stated what everyone had seen. A frontal assault against a mountain of rock was pointless, and the weak spot in the core, if it even existed, still had to be found. Ren laid out his trump card on the table, compiled over 3 weeks from intelligence reports and interrogations of scouts. The father wasn't born a mountain. He became one. The core of the cataclysm was building up rock around itself in layers, like an inverted pearl, and the layers were held together not by stone, but by energy. The core was constantly expending itself to maintain the integrity of its armor. That pointed to a strategy, not to pierce the armor, but to force the father to expend himself. Force him to build up, rebuild, and patch himself faster than the core could replenish itself from the zone's surges. A siege in reverse. A fortress with a bottomless rear wears down a creature whose rear is finite. Wall asked over the radio how long such a siege would last. Ren answered honestly. Weeks. The council was silent for a long time, and then Tessa spoke for everyone, saying that this is exactly why fortresses are built. The siege began at dawn and proceeded in waves after 2 weeks of hell. Now the artillery crews are striking the father's support points every time he approaches, forcing him to expend energy on readjusting his gait. Kano targets the fresh dents in the armor and forces them to patch the same spot 5 times over. At night, the sappers lay mines along the approaches, and the morning explosions blast tons of rock from the fortress's walls. Ren's cells are firing more shells than the entire column weighed at the entrance. And Orvin, speaking over the radio from the city, refuses to believe the supply reports. the father learned to adapt. On the fourth day, he began to hurl them. Boulders the size of a bus flew a kilometer, and the fortress held out only thanks to Irene's armor in the basements. On the seventh day, he summoned his retinue, and the creature's nighttime assault cost the garrison 30 men. On the 10th day, he did something no one expected. He severed the core's connection to the zone deep underground and didn't show himself for 3 days, replenishing his strength from the deep veins. Dre said grimly that the enemy had figured out their plan and was playing the same game. The battle turned into a game of mutual attrition. By the end of the second week, the fortress was still standing, but the men were not. The garrison was on its last legs. Ren's scale hung in the balance from one convoy of cores to the next. And then a report came in that turned the tables. From the roof, Kano noticed a pattern in the father's absences. The creature always went to replenish itself at the same spot, beyond the slag heaps, near the old mine shaft. A reconnaissance team crawled out there at night and returned with a sight that silenced the basement. The mine shaft glowed. Below, at the depth of the horizon, lay the zone's energy vein, and while replenishing itself, the father would send a part of himself down to it. He was opening up. He was pulling his core from the depths of his body toward the lower supports to drink directly from the vein. During those hours, the mountain of rock above was an empty shell, and the core hung in the mine shaft, covered by only a few meters of rock instead of hundreds. Tessa looked at the diagram of the shaft and said it was a window. Dre said it was a one-way door because they'd have to strike from below, from the mine levels, point blank. Ren remained silent, calculating the depths and cross-sections of the old workings using the pre-war plant blueprints that had been in his lockers since the first day of training. Then he looked up and said that the storekeeper knew these levels because his old company had serviced the plant and that he would lead the group down himself. The column fought its way to the plant and turned the administrative building into a fortress with a resonant, bottomless rear. The master of the epicenter, the mountain father of cataclysmic rank, turned out to be a mountain of armor surrounding the core, and Ren imposed a siege of attrition on him, forcing him to expend energy on repairs. The father began to replenish himself from a deep vein through an old mine shaft, pulling the core toward the lower supports. Important details. During recharge periods, the core is covered by meters of rock and is vulnerable from below via the mine levels. Ren has pre-war mine layout plans. He is personally leading the underground team. The garrison is exhausted after 2 weeks of siege. The underground team was assembled from 12 men, and each volunteered on the second try because Ren had turned them all down the first time. He took Tessa and Kano, 4 of Irene's sappers, and 5 of Wall's assault troops, the ones who had fought on the field near the hub. The plan of attack was as simple as a crowbar and as precise as a clock. The old ventilation tunnel ran 40 meters below the injection point. The sappers were preparing a targeted camouflage charge using all the incendiary and high-explosive materials that the accelerated sections could double in 3 days. At the moment when Father opens up and lowers the projectile toward the vein, the charge blasts away 40 meters of rock, and the group strikes the newly opened breach with everything that cannot be spoken aloud in Orvin's presence. The trap required bait because after the 10th day, the Father descended to the vein irregularly and stockpiled supplies for long periods. The fortress itself was designated as the bait. On the appointed night, the garrison was to stage a general breakout to the south with noise and light so that the Father would expend his strength on the strike and go to replenish his supplies. Wall personally took on the role of the doomed rearguard, and in his hands, it didn't look like a play. 3 days of preparation passed amid the rumble of the mine shafts. Here, the sappers are carrying tons of explosives by hand through the tunnels, and the senior among them is turning gray before our eyes as he calculates the TNT equivalent. Here, Kano marks out the firing line in the lower tunnel, and his crew assembles the gun mounts, weapons that would have been considered museum pieces back in the city. Here, Ren leads a group along the horizontal tunnels, using the old routes of the scouts and, using resonance, marks an underground warehouse in a dead-end chamber, turning the mountain into their own rear base. Up above, the fortress is rehearsing a faint breakthrough, and Dre is choreographing a scene of desperation with the precision of an accountant. On the night of the operation, everything began right on schedule. The fortress erupted with light and the roar of engines, and the decoy convoy raced south. Father emerged from behind the spoil heaps to intercept them and fired so fiercely that earth rained down from the roof of the tunnels. Wall fought back with his rear guard and retreated according to schedule. The creature expended its energy lavishly and greedily, and after 2 hours, it retreated to the shaft to replenish itself. The group on the horizon felt its arrival with every fiber of their being. The rock began to sing. A white light flowed through the cracks in the tunnels. Father opened fire and aimed the shell at the vein, and Ren's instruments showed a distance of 38 meters. He gave the countdown, and the sappers closed the circuit. The detonation struck like a fist to the mountain's jaw from below. 40 meters of rock above the horizon bulged outward and was blown into the shaft's cavity, and light so intense poured into the tunnel that flashlights became unnecessary. Hanging in the void above the firing line was a cataclysmic core the size of a house. It was not defenseless. Ribs of fresh armor instantly began to form around it, and strands of rock reached out toward it from the shaft walls like arms. But the opening was wide open, and they struck it with everything they had. The Kano machine guns fired armor-piercing rounds point blank. Sappers detonated directed charges along the strands, preventing the core from closing. Tessa and the assault troops held the tunnel against the creatures of the retinue that had surged in from the horizons above. Ren stood at the center of the line and did what no one else could. His cells devoured the emptying belts and spat out full ones faster than hands could reload them. The battle in the tunnel lasted 11 minutes, and each minute felt like a year. The core's armor thickened while the fire stripped it away and the balance teetered on a knife's edge. In the 8th minute, the father above realized he was dying from below and made his final move. He threw himself down. His entire mountain of a body plummeted down the shaft to bury the line beneath him. The roof of the horizon cracked, and then Ren used what he had been silently preparing. The resonance chamber at the dead end was designated not for storage, but for reception. He turned the bound volume toward the collapse, and thousands of metric tons of falling rock poured into inventory like water into a funnel. The scale howled. Blood flooded his nose and ears. But the roof held, and in the cleared shaft remained a bare core encased in a cage of severed wiring harnesses. A final point-blank volley split it into 3 pieces. The light went out so abruptly that darkness struck his eyes. Up above, they heard the roar, but didn't immediately realize that the glow above the epicenter was fading. Ren approached the shattered core, knee-deep in rubble. The absorption process took 40 minutes, and they had to hold him by the shoulders from both sides because his body was arching. 120,000 units didn't fit entirely. A third of it entered up to the rank's hard limit, and Ren sealed the rest in cells with 3 fragments, like in a jar. The system showered him with windows. 7th rank. The resonance limit has been lifted. The storage network function has been unlocked, and Ren put off documenting it for later because he couldn't stand.
The group was carried upstairs in people's arms. There were no casualties among the 12, and Hale later swore that such a thing never happens and that he'd written it down. The fortress greeted them with silence, and then, with the roar of 800 throats, Father lay behind the slag heaps, a dead ridge, and the maternal zone was already turning gray at the edges, losing its color.
And a day later came what Dre called the price for all the good things. The system displayed a regional window with a black border. The destruction of the anchor entity had destabilized the synchronization. The peak arrived not according to the projected schedule in 10 days, but in 72 hours, and all zones in the region entered the final surge simultaneously. Creatures from all the edges broke ranks and headed where they were meant to feed, toward the city. Ren stood by the radio, listening to the reports and looking south, where 200 kilometers away stood the walls, Martha Levin, and everything this whole operation had been undertaken for. The convoy emerged from the dead epicenter an hour later without resting and headed south, carrying the core in 3 fragments, 760 people, and the final battle in its wake. The underground camouflage team exposed the refueling point and, in an 11-minute close-quarters battle, shattered the Mountain Father's core, while Ren absorbed the mountain's collapse with his resonance chamber. It took 1/3 of the 120,000 units up to the rank limit and locked the rest in cells using 3 fragments, thereby achieving 7th rank, lifting the resonance limit, and unlocking the storage network function. Important details. The anchor's death accelerated the catastrophe, and the synchronization peak will occur in 72 hours with a strike from all zones across the city. The convoy, without rest, is heading south toward the final defense. The return trip took 30 hours, and the column rolled into the city 42 hours before the peak. The city greeted them with the sight of a besieged anthill. Byron's wall stood along the entire northern and eastern perimeters, but the people on them could already see the horizon. The horizon was moving. Intelligence reports landed on the headquarters desk every half hour, all painting the same picture. 3 large streams of creatures from all the dying zones were merging into a single wave, and that wave was advancing on the city across a broad front. The count was in the tens of thousands. The Defense Council was in continuous session, and Ren walked in straight from the road with a map and a plan he'd been working out in the back of the truck between bouts of sleep. The plan hinged on a new function, and that function changed everything. The network of storage facilities allowed remote resonance points to be linked into a single repository with instantaneous transfer of contents between them. Before, his inventory had traveled with him. Now it could be everywhere at once. Ren spread out the circuit diagram and marked 12 crosses on it. 12 strongholds along the wall, each housing a resonance chamber of the network. Ammo, food, and medicine are loaded into the hub and appear at all 12 points simultaneously. The defense gained something no army of the old world ever had: supply without a supply line. Headquarters looked at the diagram in silence, and then Wall said that in his youth, people used to be shot for ideas like this, as if they were science fiction. Orvin signed it without finishing the document. 40 hours of preparation went into installing the system across the entire city. Here's Ren driving around the perimeter, marking the fort cameras one by one, and after each mark, blood runs from his nose because the network devours power like there's no tomorrow. Here, Irene is installing the final plates on the fort, and her blacksmiths are sleeping by the forges for 2 hours at a time. Here, Finn is rushing the last grain caravans through the hub, and Gaspar is counting the inventory of the fund, a stack as thick as a fist, by candlelight. Here, Hale is setting up a second line of field hospitals behind the wall and stowing a supply of blood and sporicide in the resonance niches. Here, Tessa is assigning 800 veterans to the sector's epicenter at the most vulnerable bastions, and her voice has dropped to a whisper, but a whisper is heard better than a scream. The city dug and hauled and prayed, each in their own way. And in the eyes of the people on the walls, Ren saw not panic, but grim resolve. 3 months of plenty had given them a strength that fear cannot provide. 10 hours before the peak, the final intelligence report arrived, and it contained a line that silenced the command center. It wasn't just swarms advancing at the head of the rampart. Intelligence had counted 11 leader-class creatures and 3 disaster-class signatures in the stream. The orphaned zones were pushing their entire elite toward the city. The walls held back the swarms. Against the disasters, the walls were as thin as paper. Ren left headquarters and went out onto the bastion, standing there for a long time, gazing north. Then he descended to the control room of the central fort and opened the interface to the page he had been avoiding for 3 days. 3 fragments of the Cataclysm core lay in the cells, holding 80,000 trapped units. The strict rank limit kept them out of the scale. But beneath the 7th rank limit line, another line appeared, small and gray. Emergency overlimit. A one-time absorption exceeding the limit with irreversible redistribution of the excess into the carrier structure. Consequence forecast unavailable. The system honestly stated that it did not know what would happen to him. Ren closed the window and told no one. An hour before the peak, the entire city's able-bodied population took up positions on the walls. 21,000 people lined the perimeter. Bakers and teachers stood among the veterans, holding Iren crossbows, assembled over the past month in batches of thousands from doubled-up components. Network cameras breathed across the 12 forts. In the hub at the control consoles, Gaspar and Finn stood by the bookmarks with a supply schedule for 18 hours of battle. Dre took his place at the communications hub, and for the first time, his computing machines were processing real-time data on living people. The dawn of the peak never came. Instead of dawn, dust rose from the north to the sky, and the earth hummed steadily and low. The wave appeared over the hilltops at 6:20, and it had no flanks. It stretched from horizon to horizon. Ren stood at the central fort between Tessa and the wall and watched as all that remained of the daying zones advanced on the city. Kano, in the watchtower, clicked the bolt and spoke his only phrase of the morning into the general channel. He said the range was 3,000 and that we were on it. The first salvo of the perimeter fire struck the entire wall at once, and the front of the wave was by explosions. The rampart did not slow down. It simply continued to march through its own death, just as it had marched through the dead settlements. And the final battle of the old world began amid a roar that the people on the walls would remember for the rest of their lives. The column returned 42 hours before the peak, and Ren deployed a network of storage facilities linking the hub to the 12 outflank forts and providing the defense with instant without resupply. The city deployed 21,000 men to the walls. At the head of the rampart march, 11 leaders and 3 disaster rank beasts against whom the walls are powerless. Important details. Ren has 80,000 units locked away in 3 fragments, and there is an emergency limit override function with unknown consequences that he has kept secret. The rampart, stretching from horizon to horizon, reached the walls, and the battle began. For the first 6 hours, the defense operated like a machine that Ren had spent 3 months assembling. The wave pressed against the northern perimeter in surges, and the waves crashed against a combination of fire and walls. The network of storage facilities proved more fearsome than any weapon. The forts knew no such thing as, "It's over." Overheated barrels were replaced with fresh ones from the niches. The crews drank and ate without leaving their positions. Hale treated the wounded with sporacid without counting the cost, and his hospital, the only one in the history of the wars, had no waiting list for the medication. From the communications hub, Dre managed the redistribution of supplies among the forts based on workload, and his voice on the channel sounded like a metronome. By noon, in front of the northern wall lay a wall of creatures as tall as the wall itself, and swarms began to climb it as if it were a ramp. Then the vanguard moved in. The leaders struck in groups of 3 at the joints between the bastions, and wherever they struck, the entire wall shook. The veterans at the epicenter met them with well-rehearsed precision. Tessa's spear groups pinned down and entangled the creatures at the edge, while Kano's crews fired crossfire into the air vents from neighboring forts. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 7 of the 11 leaders lay within the general wall of creatures, but each had cost the defense dozens of men. And Ren, from the central fort, saw the crews thinning out and the stockpiles in the niches dwindling, because even the bottomless warehouse had a limited supply capacity. And at 5 o'clock, disaster struck. 3 signatures emerged from the wall of dust in different directions simultaneously, and headquarters realized that this was no coincidence but a herding tactic of the dying zones. In the east, a creature made of fused glass from the city dump was advancing toward the wall. In the north, a carcass resembling the grave choir was rolling forward, but twice as large. And in the west, where the wall was weakest because it shielded the old neighborhoods, a ridge rose from the river that hadn't been mentioned in any of the reports. The river silt rose in a column, and a shell was burning within that column. 3 disasters in 3 directions, with only 7 hours of daylight. No one in the world had the reserves for 3 such battles. Headquarters made the only possible decision, and it was the arithmetic of despair. The glass disaster in the east was taken on by Wall with the guard and all the artillery of the right wing. Tessa, along with the veterans of the epicenter, took on the northern front using the fire brigade tactic, honed on Hora, right up against the wall. No one was left for the western ridge. Wren stood over the map and heard Dry announce in an even voice the time until the western wall would be breached. 40 minutes. Beyond the wall lay the neighborhoods where the non-combatants had been evacuated. Hale's hospital was there. Martha Levin was there. Wren closed his eyes and opened the interface on the gray bar. He descended from the fort in silence, and by the vehicle, Tessa, who was on her way to her unit, caught up with him. She looked him in the face and understood everything, because she'd fought alongside him for 3 months. She didn't try to talk him out of it. She only said that a warehouse without a storekeeper was just a pile of boxes, and that he should get back to the inventory. By the time Wren reached the western wall, it was already under attack.
The ridge pounded the concrete with a battering ram of silt, stone, and slabs. Irene's slabs were bursting at the seams. He entered the resonance chamber of the western fort, bolted the door behind him, and laid 3 shards of a cataclysmic projectile on the floor. The system asked for confirmation twice. Emergency threshold exceeded. Irreversible. Forecast unavailable. He confirmed the command and placed his palms on the shards.
80,000 units flooded into him, not like a river, but like an avalanche. The world turned white and remained white. He didn't remember how the scale had blazed, how its upper limit had burst, or how the system had redistributed the excess to a place within a person where there are no divisions. He came to while standing and didn't know how much time had passed. The interface hung before his eyes, reconfigured. The scale was gone. In its place stood a number with no ceiling. The functions of the network, resonance and cycle had merged into a single line, and that line was simply called storage. And beneath it, a new inscription glowed. The carrier has been recognized as an anchor structure. Wren stepped out of the chamber onto the wall, and the world felt different. He could feel all 12 chambers of the network as if they were his own fingers. He felt the cells as an extension of his ribs. The ridge behind the wall raised its battering ram for the final blow, and Wren did what would once have cost him his life. He executed a maneuver right in midair in front of the wall, just as he would have in a tunnel facing a cave-in. The battering ram, made of hundreds of metric tons of silt, entered the storage chamber whole, and the ridge swayed, losing its balance and half its mass. Wren stepped down from the wall onto the crest of his own absorption and walked toward the core along the creature's sinking body, absorbing into the vault everything it hurled at him: silt, stone, water, darkness. At the core, he stopped and did not fire. He placed both palms on the burning stone and opened the receptacle as he had done with the Guardian, with Horus, and with the Father, only now without limit. The core of the calamity resisted for 4 minutes and entered the boundless void entirely. The ridge sank into the river like a dead island. Silence hung on the wall, and then the western perimeter roared so loudly that it was heard on the eastern side. By 8 in the evening, Wall had subdued the glass creature, having lost half his guard. By 9, Tessa's corral had burned the northern carcass to ashes according to Hor's method. By midnight, the leaderless Wall had lost its will and began to break up into flocks, and the flocks began to flee. The system displayed a regional notification announcing the completion of synchronization and the transition of the zones into the residual phase. The city stood. Wren sat on the edge of the western wall, dangling his legs over the dead river, and gazed at the number without a ceiling. Hale found him there after midnight, shone a light in his eyes, and asked how he was feeling. Wren honestly replied that he didn't know who he felt like. The doctor sat down beside him, paused for a moment, and said that was normal. He said that none of them were quite the same people they had been in October, and that what makes a person isn't their structure, but the inventory of what they've chosen to preserve. The defenses withstood the onslaught thanks to the network of storage facilities, but 3 disaster-rank creatures struck simultaneously from 3 directions, and there were no forces left for the Western Front. Wren secretly performed an emergency overload, absorbing 80,000 units from the debris of the Cataclysm core. His limits vanished, and the system recognized him as an anchor structure. He personally absorbed the Western catastrophe along with the core. Wall and Tessa finished off their targets. Important details. Synchronization is complete, and the zones have entered the residual phase. The city held out, though, with heavy losses. Ren has changed irreversibly and does not yet know the limits of his new state. For the first week after the peak, the city was in mourning, and this was the only task the Foundation could not alleviate. 2,300 names were inscribed on the lists on the wall by the northern gate, and Ren read them all while standing in the general line, because the reserve administrator is expected to know the value of an inventory. Then the city began to come back to life, and life went on in fits and starts through the winter. Here, Irene's crews are dismantling the wall of beasts at the city walls. The steel goes to be remelted, and the cannonballs go to the Foundation's treasury. Here, refugees from the northern settlements are returning to the land of the residual zones, where the beasts have been reduced to the level of wolves. Here is Finn leading the first caravan to the neighboring alliance, and the neighbors greet the heirs to the share with an honor guard and downcast eyes. Here, at the regional council, Orvin reads aloud the Foundation's charter, establishing it as a permanent institution with a supervisory board comprising representatives from all the guilds. And Ren is the first to sign the charter. He kept the promise he made to himself on the western wall. The ceilingless vault did not become a throne. It became infrastructure. Over the winter, the network grew to 40 chambers across the region, and what had started as a secret anomaly had doubled in scale, becoming a routine part of the economy, just as electricity once had. The word shortage fell out of use. Dre led the fund's audit office and said that, for the first time in his life, his numbers aligned with his conscience. In the spring, it was time to settle personal accounts. Ren made a trip to Block 7. The house was still standing. Martha Liven was alive and raising chickens on the roof, and she made him promise to come over for soup on Sundays. Tarn, a former tax collector, was working as a loader in the Foundation's warehouses. And when Ren found out, he did nothing about it because that job itself was the worst punishment Tarn could face. Gaspar bought out an entire arcade to house his shop, and his gold tooth gleamed above the best counter in the region. Hale was assigned the former Vanguard headquarters to use as a hospital, and grumbled that paperwork was worse than monsters. Ada, Finn's sister, enrolled in the first school to open, and at the opening ceremony recited a poem she'd written herself about an ear of wheat on a white flag. Tessa and Kano took on a grant to clear the remaining zones, and before leaving, Tessa told Ren that his inventory had turned out well. He himself climbed the western wall once more, alone that spring. The number without a ceiling lived within him, steady and quiet. Over the winter, the system hadn't sent a single new window, as if it had said everything it wanted to say. He no longer checked the scale at night. He had learned a simple formula from Hale and repeated it like a storekeeper's prayer. A person is defined by the inventory of what they have chosen to keep. His inventory was in order. In the summer, the regional council convened for its first peaceful session, and Orwin, for the record, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. He asked what the Foundation intended to do next, now that the region was well fed and the walls were standing. Ren walked over to the map and hung a second one next to it. The second map showed not a region, but a continent, and scattered across the continent in gray patches were the areas about which the radio had reported terrible things. They hadn't survived the synchronization there. Cities had fallen, and the survivors were huddled among the ruins, without guilds and without supplies. Ren said that the warehouse didn't exist to be full. A warehouse exists to distribute supplies. He proposed a caravan project heading south and west, equipped with the network's mobile cameras, and the council voted unanimously for the first time in its history. The first long-distance caravan set out at the end of summer from the hub's gates, and the entire city turned out to see it off. 100 vehicles, 300 guards from 3 guilds, a mobile camera in the lead van, personally marked by Ren. He stood at the gates where a homemade flag bearing an ear of grain had once been raised, receiving reports just as he had received them throughout this impossible life. Tessa reported that the guards were ready. Finn reported on the travel schedule. Dre reported on the cargo manifest down to the very last crate. Ren signed the manifest and paused for a second on the first line. Canned meat was the first item in the caravan. He laughed out loud for the first time in a long time and didn't bother explaining it to anyone. A year ago, he'd been sitting on the kitchen floor with two identical cans in his hands, his only thought being how to survive until the tribute was collected. The can had doubled in size, and everything else had doubled along with it. Courage, responsibility, people by his side, the price he had to pay. He'd thought back then that he'd found a way to survive on his own. It turned out he'd found a way for everyone to survive. The caravan set off, and its dust drifted south toward lands where people didn't yet know that scarcity was deadly. Ren watched until the head of the column disappeared behind the hill. Then he turned toward the city. The city buzzed with the market, construction, and the school bell, and that noise was the best ledger of all the ones he kept. In the evening, he climbed the hub tower with a mug of tea and opened the interface simply out of habit. The storage facility monitored the entire region evenly with 40 cameras. The cycles ran. The number stood at an unlimited level with no alerts. At the very bottom of the interface, where warnings used to appear, the system displayed a new line for the first time in a year, and the line was short. Carrier status, stable. Ren smiled, closed the window, and didn't open it again that day. Down below, the lights of the city, a city that had learned not to fear tomorrow, were coming on. Somewhere to the south, a caravan was on the move. Somewhere in the residual zones, Tessa was hunting down the last of the large creatures. Somewhere, Martha Livin was cooking Sunday soup for two. The inventory matched up. The storekeeper had finished taking stock and stayed in the warehouse, not because he had to, but because that was where he belonged. The story of the man whose storage cell doubled his canned meat supply ended exactly where it was meant to end, in a world where there was finally enough for everyone. The city had weathered a winter of reconstruction, and the Foundation had become a permanent institution in the region, with a network of 40 storage cells. The doubling mechanism had become the foundation of an economy that had conquered scarcity. All lines are closed. Tarn became a loader for the Foundation, Gaspar, the wealthiest merchant, Hale, the head of the hospital, Dry, the head of the audit office, and Tessa and Kano are clearing the remaining zones of hell. Ada went to school. Martha is alive. Ren directed the Foundation's resources outward, sending the first aid caravan to the fallen regions of the continent, and at the top of the inventory list was the can of meat with which it all began. The carrier's status is stable. The hero has achieved his goal and found his place. For the first 6 hours, the defense operated like a machine that Ren had spent 3 months assembling. The wave pressed against the northern perimeter, and the waves crashed against a combination of fire and walls. The network of storage facilities proved more fearsome than any weapon. The forts knew no such thing as "it's over." Overheated barrels were replaced with fresh ones from the niches. The crews drank and ate without leaving their positions. Hale treated the wounded with sporicid by the hundreds, and his hospital, the only one in the history of the wars, had no waiting list for the medication. From the communications hub, Dre managed the redistribution of supplies among the forts based on workload, and his voice over the channel sounded like a metronome. Bakers and teachers on the walls reloaded Irene's crossbows, and after 3 o'clock, they stopped flinching at the explosions. Fear had burned away, and only the work remained. Ren walked the perimeter from fort to fort. People recognized him, and at the sight of his back, they stood up straight. People didn't believe in miracles. People believed in the fully stocked supply niches behind them, and that was the faith he had been building for a year. By noon, a wall of creatures as tall as the northern wall itself lay before it, and swarms began to climb it as if it were a ramp. The front line of the battle rose to the level of the battlements, and close-quarters combat began. Then the vanguard advanced. The leaders struck in groups of 3 at the joints between the bastions, and wherever they struck, the entire wall shook. The veterans at the epicenter met them with well-honed tactics. Tessa's spear teams pinned down and entangled the creatures at the front line, while Kano's crews fired crossfire into the air vents from the neighboring forts. The first leader fell at the 4th bastion in 6 minutes. The second dragged an entire crew, along with their machine, down into the moat with him. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 7 of the 11 leaders lay in the common rampart, but each had cost the defense dozens of men, and Ren, from the central fort, saw the crews thinning out and the charges melting away in the niches, because even the bottomless warehouse had a limited supply capacity. Gaspar from headquarters reported that the planting crews were falling at their consoles, and that he had assigned his own foreman to handle the supply. The city was squeezing every last drop out of itself, and there was almost enough of everything. Almost. And at 5 o'clock, disaster struck. 3 signatures emerged from the dust wall in different directions simultaneously, and headquarters realized this was no coincidence but a herding tactic of the dying zones. In the east, a creature made of caked-together glass from the city dump was advancing toward the wall, and the setting sun burned within it like 1,000 shards, making it painful to look at even before the terror. In the north, a carcass resembling the grave choir rolled forward, but twice as large, and its multi-voiced rumble jammed radios within a kilometer. And in the west, where the wall was at its weakest because it shielded the old neighborhoods, a ridge rose from the river that hadn't been mentioned in a single report. River silt rose in a column as tall as a grain elevator, and a shell was burning inside that column. Intelligence had missed it because the creature was moving along the riverbed and showed no signature until it surfaced. 3 disasters in 3 directions, with only 7 hours of daylight. No one in the world had the reserves for 3 such battles. Headquarters made the only possible decision, and it was the arithmetic of desperation. Wall, along with the guard and all the artillery of the right wing, took on the glass disaster in the east. The guild leader listened to the assessment, nodded, and said over the channel that the glass was shattering and that he would personally check it out. Tessa, along with veterans from the epicenter, took on the northern sector using the fire brigade tactic honed at Cora, right up against the wall, and sappers were already rolling barrels of incendiary mixture toward the northern gates. No one remained on the western ridge. Ren stood over the map and heard Dry state in an even voice the time it would take to breach the western wall. 40 minutes. The analyst stated it as if it were a currency exchange rate, and only his fingers crumpled the edge of the map. Beyond the wall lay the neighborhoods where the non-combatants had been herded. There was Hale's hospital with 600 wounded who could neither be lifted nor evacuated. There was the school that had become a refuge. There was Martha Liven. Ren stared at the western sector of the map, and inside him, the storekeeper weighed the scales one last time. On one side lay his life and the uncertainty of the gray line. On the other lay everything else. The scales tipped instantly and without hesitation. He closed his eyes, opened the interface on the gray line of the emergency override, and reread the 3 words. Irreversible. Forecast unavailable. Confirm. He descended from the fort in silence, and at the car, Tessa, who was on her way back to her unit, caught up with him. She looked him in the face and understood everything, because she'd fought alongside him for 3 months and knew that expression. That was how he'd looked before the spear attack on the Guardian and before descending into the tunnels. She didn't try to talk him out of it, because trying to dissuade him was like trying to dissuade an inventory from its final tally. She took the cord from around her neck with the shell casing from their first battle together and silently hung it around his neck. Then she said that a warehouse without a storekeeper was just a pile of boxes and that he should go back to the inventory. Ren replied that the inventory tolerated no open positions and got into the car. He encountered the western wall already under attack. The ridge pounded the concrete with a battering ram of silt, stone, and slabs. And Irene's slabs burst at the seams with a sound that Ren remembered as the crack of the world. The sector's garrison consisted of 2 incomplete companies, and their commander, a hoarse-voiced captain, simply pointed to his watch. Wren ordered the men to withdraw from the perimeter into the depths of the forts, and the captain obeyed without asking why. Because the orders of the fund's administrator were not to be questioned in this city. He entered the resonance chamber of the western fort, bolted the door behind him, and laid 3 fragments of a cataclysm core on the floor. It was quiet in the chamber, and the sound of the battering ram striking could be heard through meters of concrete. The fragments glowed steadily and patiently, just as they had for 3 weeks in their cells. 80,000 confined units awaited a decision. The system asked for confirmation twice. Emergency threshold exceeded. Irreversible redistribution of the excess into the carrier structure. Consequence forecast unavailable. Between the second question and the answer, Wren had time to think of a strange thing. He thought that a year ago he'd been afraid of the tax collector, and now he was bargaining with the universe, and that the difference between these fears was smaller than it seemed. Both times, the same thing was at stake: the people behind the door. He confirmed the command and placed his palms on the debris. 80,000 units flooded into him, not like a river, but like an avalanche. The world turned white and remained white. The whiteness was not light. It was the absence of everything, and within that absence, Wren was taken apart and reassembled, like a warehouse undergoing a full inventory. He didn't remember how the scale had burned, or how its upper limit had burst with the sensation of a thread snapping inside. He didn't remember how the system redistributed the excess to a place within a person where there are no divisions or labels. He remembered only one thing through the white: the cartridge on a string. A small weight on his chest that meant they were waiting for him outside. He came to while standing and didn't know how much time had passed. The blood on the cell floor had already dried, which meant a lot of time had passed. The interface hung before his eyes, reconfigured. The scale was gone. In its place stood a number with no upper limit. The functions of the network, resonance, and cycle had merged into a single line, and that line was simply called storage. And beneath it, a new message glowed. The carrier has been recognized as an anchor structure. Wren read it 3 times and understood its meaning only with his body. Before, he had carried the equipment. Now the equipment was him. He stepped out of the chamber onto the wall, and the world felt different. The air had volume and weight. He felt all 12 chambers of the network as if they were his own fingers, and he sensed in the 3rd northern chamber how Tessa was taking the fire mixture for the pen. He felt the cells as an extension of his ribs. The ridge behind the wall raised a battering ram for the final blow against the cracked slab, and Wren did what would once have cost him his life, but now required no more effort than reaching out his hand. He executed the maneuver right into the air in front of the wall, just as he would have in a tunnel facing a cave-in. The battering ram, made of hundreds of metric tons of silt, entered the vault whole and silently, and the ridge swayed, losing its balance and half its mass at once. On the wall, someone from the garrison screamed, not out of fear, but at the impossibility of what they were seeing. Wren stepped down from the wall onto the crest of his own absorption and walked toward the core, stepping over the creature's sinking body, taking into the vault everything it hurled at him: silt, stone, silt, water. Bundles of muscle as thick as a bridge. The darkness of bottomless cold. For the first time in its life, the disaster-rank creature encountered a being that was deeper than itself, and it heard a new note cut through its rumble. The note sounded like fear. He stopped at the core and did not fire. There was no need to fire. It placed both palms on the burning stone and opened the channel as it had with the Guardian, with Horus, and with the Father, only now without limit and without a nosebleed. The core of Calamity resisted for 4 minutes. It thrashed in its grip like a heart in a stranger's fist and drew energy from the remnants of its body, and Wren patiently accepted that too. Then it entered the boundless void entirely, and the ridge sank into the river as a dead island where, a year from now, children would fish. Silence hung on the wall, and then the western perimeter roared so loudly that they heard it on the eastern side. and the scream rolled along the ring of walls like a wave. By 8 in the evening, Wall had crushed the glass creature, having lost half his guard and his right arm up to the elbow. And that evening at the hospital, he demanded of Hale not consolation, but a prosthetic arm for his two-handed sword. By 9, Tessa's unit had burned the northern carcass to a crisp according to Horace's teachings, and the veterans carried all their wounded out of the fire, one. By midnight, the leaderless wave had lost its will and began to break up into flocks, and the flocks into a stampede, and Kano, with his company, escorted the fleeing through the fire until dawn to ensure they did not return. The system displayed a regional notification about the completion of synchronization and the transition of the zones into the residual phase. The city stood. Ren sat on the edge of the western wall, dangling his legs over the dead river, and stared at the number without a ceiling. The number didn't frighten him, and that frightened him most of all. He raised his palm to his eyes and studied it for a long time in the light of the fires. The palm was the same as before. A loader's calluses, a scar from a tire iron. Hale found him there after midnight, shone a flashlight in his eyes, and asked how he was feeling. Ren answered honestly that he didn't know how he felt. The doctor sat down next to him on the cold concrete, paused for a moment, and pulled out a flask containing something banned in every hospital in the world. Then he said it was normal. He said that none of them were quite the same people they'd been back in October. A baker who'd become a sniper. An accountant who'd become the conscience of the defense forces. A mercenary who'd become a corps commander. He said that what makes a person isn't their structure but the inventory of what they've chosen to keep, and that Ren's inventory had always been in order. They sat on the wall until the gray dawn, silent, while below, the dead river carried the first calm waters past the city in a long year. The defense held the onslaught thanks to the network of storage facilities. But 3 disaster-rank beasts struck simultaneously, and on the western sector, where the hospital and shelters had run out of strength, Ren secretly executed an emergency override, absorbing 80,000 units. His limits vanished, and the system recognized him as an anchor structure, making the storage facility a part of himself. He absorbed the western disaster along with its core using his bare hands. Wall lost an arm, but finished off the glass creature, while Tessa incinerated the northern one. Important details. Synchronization is complete, and the zones are in the residual phase. The city held out at the cost of heavy losses. Ren has changed irrevocably. He wears Tessa's shell and does not know the limits of his new state, but his palms remain the same. For the first week after the peak, the city held funerals, and this was the only task the Foundation could not alleviate. 2,300 names were inscribed on the lists on the wall by the northern gate, and Ren read them all while standing in the general line, because it is the duty of the reserve administrator to know the value of an inventory. The line moved in silence, and no one gave up their place for him. He was more grateful for that than for any honors. He stood the longest at the name of the hoarse-voiced captain of the western sector. The captain had died an hour before Ren's arrival, holding the line that by all accounts could not be held. Then the city began to come back to life, and life moved in fits and starts through the winter. Here, Irene's crews are dismantling the wall of beasts at the city walls. The steel goes to be remelted and the cannonballs go to the fund's treasury, while Irene herself is forging a prosthetic arm for Vala to use with a two-handed sword, grumbling that this is the first time she's made a weapon that's actually worn. Here, refugees from the northern settlements are returning to the land of the residual zones, where the beasts have been reduced to the size of wolves, and the first convoy of resettlers is setting out under the protection of veterans, carrying seed grain from the accelerated sections. Here, Finn leads the first caravan to the neighboring alliance, and the neighbors greet the heirs of the Pate clan with an honor guard and downcast eyes, while Finn carries himself with the dignity of an ambassador, and only in the evening, by the campfire, admits to his guards that his knees were shaking the whole way. Here, Orvin reads aloud the Foundation's charter at the Regional Council, establishing it as a permanent institution with a supervisory board comprising representatives from all the guilds and granting any settlement the right to audit the warehouses. Wren is the first to sign the charter and insists on the clause regarding self-accountability. The council looks at him as if he were a man who had voluntarily put on a collar, and he explains simply, "Power without oversight spoils like food left out in the heat." He kept the promise he made to himself on the western wall. The warehouse without a ceiling did not become a throne. It became infrastructure. Over the winter, the network grew to 40 chambers across the region, and what had started as a secret anomaly doubled in scale, becoming a standard part of the economy, just as electricity once did. Children at the new school were solving problems involving cycles and feed rates, unaware that they were solving problems about a miracle. The word shortage dropped out of everyone's vocabulary, first among merchants, then among everyone else. Dre led the fund's audit office and built an accounting system as transparent as glass. He said that for the first time in his life, his numbers aligned with his conscience, and that for the sake of that alignment, it was worth living through everything else. Wren bought the neighborhood's former hiding places from their silent guardians at triple the price, and Martha Liven used that money to refuse to move out of Block 7. Because where the chickens are, there's home. In the spring, it was time to close out personal inventories. Wren went to Block 7 alone, without guards and without warning. The house was still standing. The courtyard was both the same and different. Where the hood had once stood, where Tarn used to collect his tribute, there was now a communal stove, and people were arguing over recipes by the stove. Martha Leven was alive. She raised chickens on the roof, fed him soup, and made him promise to come by on Sundays. A promise he kept for years afterward. Tarn, the former collector, worked as a loader in the Foundation's warehouses. And when Wren found out about this, he did nothing because that job itself was the best punishment for Tarn. Once they came face to face while loading goods. Tarn recognized him, turned pale, and braced for retribution. Wren simply checked his delivery slip, found it correct, and said that the shift was considered complete. That was the only punishment, and Tarn understood it fully, because from that day on, he worked better than anyone else on the site. Gaspar bought out an entire arcade beneath his shop, and his gold tooth gleamed above the region's finest counter. He framed Wren's receipt for that first night shift and hung it above the cash register like an icon of the trade. Hale secured the former Vanguard headquarters for use as a hospital and grumbled that paperwork was worse than vermin. But he managed to get the council to approve a medical school, and the first class of paramedics called themselves the Sporicide class. Finn's sister Ada attended the first school to open, and at the opening ceremony, recited a poem of her own composition about an ear of grain on a white flag. While Wren, standing in the back row, stepped all the way to the front so that no one could see his face. Wall, with his new steel arm from Irene, restored the guild's name without fear in it, and the Vanguard was the first to hand over its barracks warehouses to the network's cameras. Tessa and Kano took on the Foundation's contract to clear the remaining zones and worked as thoroughly as ever. Before the first expedition set out, Tessa stopped by the hub, and Wren returned the shell casing on a string to her. She looked at the cartridge, then at him, and hung the string back around his neck. She said that things should stay where they'd survived the hardest times and that his inventory had turned out well. Kano silently shook his hand, and that was the shooter's longest speech in a year. He himself climbed the western wall once more alone that spring. The dead island in the river had turned green with the first grass, and the boys were already testing their fishing gear from it. The number without a ceiling lived within him, steady and quiet as a breath. The system hadn't sent a single new window all winter, as if it had said everything it wanted to, and Wren was grateful to it for its silence. He no longer checked the scale at night or woke from dreams of empty cells. He had learned a simple formula from Hale and repeated it like a storekeeper's prayer. A person is defined by the inventory of what they have chosen to keep. His inventory contained neither tons nor individual items. It contained Sunday soup and a school poem and a shell casing on a string, and a proper delivery slip from a former enemy. The inventory added up. In the summer, the regional council convened for its first peaceful session, and Orwin, for the record, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. He asked what the Foundation intended to do next, now that the region was well-fed and the walls were standing, and whether this abundance would turn into stagnation and the warehouse into an end in itself. Wren had been waiting for this question all winter. He walked over to the map and hung a second one next to it. The second map showed not a region, but a continent, and scattered across the continent in gray patches were the areas about which the radio had reported terrible things. There, they had not survived the synchronization. There, cities had fallen, and the survivors sat amid the ruins without guilds or supplies, eating things no one talks about. For the past 3 months, the Foundation's radio operators had been picking up fragments of pleas from there in every language. Wren said that a warehouse wasn't meant to be full. A full warehouse is just a big coffin for good things. A warehouse exists to distribute supplies, and its measure is not its balance, but its turnover. He proposed a caravan project to the south and west, equipped with mobile network cameras, and a charter prohibiting the acceptance of land or power in exchange for aid. Wall asked what the Foundation would receive in return. Wren replied that it would gain neighbors who have a tomorrow, and that this is the best border wall imaginable. The council voted unanimously for the first time in its history, and Dre recorded in the minutes that there were no abstentions. The first long-distance caravan set out at the end of summer from the hub's gates, and the entire city saw it off. 100 vehicles, 300 security personnel from 3 guilds, a mobile camera in the lead van, personally marked by Wren, and connected to the network across any distance, because for the anchor structure, distance no longer existed. He stood at the gates where a homemade flag bearing an ear of grain had once been raised, receiving reports just as he had throughout this impossible life. Tessa reported that the guards were ready. Finn reported on the travel schedule to the first dead city. Dry reported on the cargo manifest down to the very last crate. Wren signed the manifest and paused for a second, his gaze lingering on the first line. Canned meat was listed first in the caravan's cargo manifest. Ordinary canned beef in jars with a dent on the left side of the lid because they'd thrown in a jar from the old batch. He laughed out loud for the first time in a long time and didn't bother explaining it to anyone. A year ago, he'd been sitting on the kitchen floor with 2 identical jars in his hands, his only thought being how to survive until the tribute was collected. The can doubled in size, and everything else doubled along with it. Courage, responsibility, the people around him, the price he had to pay, and which he paid without hesitation. He'd thought back then that he'd found a way to survive on his own. It turned out he'd found a way for everyone to survive. The caravan set off, and its dust drifted southward into lands where people didn't yet know that scarcity was deadly. Wren watched them go until the head of the column disappeared behind the hill, and he could feel through the network how steadily the mobile camera was breathing as it moved away. Then he turned toward the city. The city buzzed with the market, construction, and the school bell, and that noise was the best log of all the ones he kept. In the evening, he climbed the hub tower with a mug of tea and opened the interface simply out of habit. The storage system was operating smoothly across the entire region, with 40 cameras and 1 pointing south. The cycles were running. The number stood at an unlimited level, with no alarm. At the very bottom of the interface, where warnings used to appear, the system displayed a new line for the first time in a year, and the line was short. Carrier status, stable. Wren smirked and thought that, as always, the system was late in pointing out the obvious. He closed the window and didn't open it again that day. Below, the lights of the city were coming on, a city that had learned not to fear tomorrow. Somewhere in the south, a caravan was traveling, and the sentry on the first night's watch was already warming a can with a dent on the left over the campfire. Somewhere in the residual zones, Tessa was hunting down the last of the large creatures, and Kano was counting her hits. Somewhere, Martha Levin was setting a pot on the stove for 2 servings for Sunday. The inventory matched up perfectly, right down to the last line. The storekeeper finished the inventory and stayed in the warehouse, not because he had to, but because this was his place among the people he had chosen to safeguard. The story of the man whose storage locker doubled his supply of canned meat ended exactly where it was meant to end. In a world where there was finally enough for everyone and where no one feared losing it anymore, the city had weathered a winter of recovery, and the fund had become a permanent, accountable institution with a network of 40 storage units, while doubling had become the foundation of an economy that had overcome scarcity. All lines are closed. Tarn was punished with the position of a porter and honest labor. Gaspar, the wealthiest merchant, with a framed receipt. Hale, the head of the hospital and medical school. Dre, the head of the audit office. Wall, with his prosthesis, restored the guild's honor. Tessa returned Wren's bullet casing. Ada read a poem about an ear of grain. Martha is cooking Sunday soup. Wren opened the fund to the public, sending an aid caravan to the stricken regions, where the first item on the inventory list is the canned meat that started it all. The carrier's status is stable. The hero has found his place among the people he chose to protect.